Chapter 2900. At this moment, the world of laws began to tremble subtly. Immediately afterwards, the fog that shrouded the world of laws gradually dissipated, allowing the originally mysterious island to finally reveal a trace of reality. At this moment, many of the world founders saw Luo Fan above the island, who was holding the three-legged cauldron. So, it's just a clone. At this moment, all the world founders were inexplicably shocked. They had originally been completely in awe of Luo Fan's strength, and they had already admitted that they were far inferior to Luo Fan. But now, they discovered that there was actually another Luo Fan in the world of laws. How could they not understand that Luo Fan, who was by their side, was only an avatar? If a normal person had the ability to split an avatar, it would be impossible for him to enter a dangerous place with his real body and leave his avatar in a safe place. The gap between us and him is actually greater than I imagined. At this moment, this thought flashed through the minds of many world founders. For a moment, they all felt inexplicably discouraged. At this moment, a huge vortex gradually emerged. This huge vortex did not appear within the formation, or rather, it did not appear within the space-time that was separated by the formation. Instead, it appeared outside the formation, outside the space-time. It directly enveloped the entire formation in the center of the vortex, making it look like a small eye in the center of the vortex. This formation was built by millions of ordinary world founders and tens of thousands of perfect world founders. Compared to all the world founders that existed in this great world, this number was naturally insignificant. However, in terms of absolute numbers, it was already a considerable number. It went without saying how large the area occupied by such a large number of world founders was. Not to mention anything else. Just the fact that this formation was able to completely envelop the island formed by the world of laws was sufficient to prove how massive this formation was. At this moment, the huge vortex was actually able to envelop the formation like an eye in the vortex. It went without saying how huge the vortex was. At this moment, the pressure on the formation began to skyrocket by more than 100 times. At the moment when the pressure increased, the sound of squeaking could be heard from all directions. This was the sound produced by the pressure created by the vortex, which was squeezing the space-time, or rather, it was the sound produced by the collapse of the space-time outside the formation. Although that terrifying pressure was acting on the formation, it was naturally impossible for the formation to be crushed by that pressure so easily. However, compared to the strength of the formation itself, the space-time around the formation wasn't as convenient. Although the pressure only affected the outside world, just the aftermath alone was enough to make the surrounding space-time that was separated by the formation unable to bear it. That was why there were such cracking sounds coming from it. Facing this situation, the countenances of the world's founders turned extremely grave. Their power constantly circulated, creating all sorts of indescribable effects. Under this rental effect, an increasingly powerful power gradually condensed in the center of the formation. In other words, at this very moment, the place where Luo Fan was constantly being condensed. This was the power that the formation was going to sublimate in the end. Weinen had just been born, but it was still extremely weak. Not to mention the power released by the world's will, it was extremely weak compared to the power produced by the vortex. Even compared to the power released by the world's founders, it was still too weak. However, compared to the power released by the world's founders, this power had unimaginable potential. After it was born, it began to rise at an unimaginable speed, showing an increasingly powerful and terrifying aura. The increase in power was naturally extremely fast in the beginning. In the blink of an eye, it had multiplied several times. In the blink of an eye, it had multiplied several times. However, as the power gradually approached the power of a complete world's founder, the speed of its increase gradually slowed down. However, the effect was completely opposite to the speed of its increase. Although the increase in power was very fast in the beginning, the effect of the formation resisting the pressure released by the world's will was rather ordinary. In fact, it was so weak that it was almost non-existent. No matter how fast the increase in power was, it didn't help the formation at all. However, as the increase in power slowed down, the effect was completely different. With every increase in power, the effect would multiply by several times. From being insignificant at the beginning, it eventually became the main force resisting the pressure from the outside world. Throughout the entire process, the increase in power was only close to 10%. In other words, it had exceeded 10% of the strongest power that a complete world's founder could unleash. Compared to the original power that could multiply by several times, it was clearly two extremes. Originally, the increase in power had almost no effect on the overall effect. But now, as the power slowly increased, the effect on the overall effect was constantly multiplying. And this was obviously not the limit of the formation. Even if it had already occupied the main position in resisting the pressure from the outside world, its power was still constantly increasing and sublimating. At the same time, the pressure released by the world's will in the outside world was also constantly increasing during this process, causing the space-time around the formation to shatter faster and faster, causing the cracking sounds to become more and more intense. Faced with such a situation, an inexplicable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. It seems that the effect is quite significant, he thought to himself. At this moment, his two incarnations were facing each other from a distance. On the island, or rather above the perfect world, the incarnation holding the three-legged cauldron was facing the incarnation in the outside world. The communication between them was unprecedentedly smooth, and endless suppressive power was continuously transmitted to the incarnation in the outside world through this communication. The incarnation in the outside world then began to pour into the formation and join the operation of the formation, adding strength to the sublimating power condensed by the world's founders. In fact, the main reason that the power could sublimate to this extent so quickly was actually because of Luo Fan's participation. If the world's founders were to be relied on, they might be able to sublimate the power to this height in the end, but it would definitely not be as fast as it was now. The time needed to be increased by at least several times, or even 10 times, or even dozens of times at this moment. Although the pressure from the outside world seemed to be at its limit, all the world's founders knew clearly that this was just the beginning. If the world's was so easy to deal with, why would they still need to waste so much time and energy to find a way to deal with it? At this moment, the world's will seemed powerless, but it was actually brewing another change. Therefore, the world's founders did not relax at all, and instead continued to push the formation with all their might. The power condensed inside the formation continued to sublimate. During this process, the power continued to increase, and its volume also continued to increase. In the beginning, it was only an insignificant small amount, but as time passed with the efforts of the world's founders, the power had unknowingly increased to the size of an island. In other words, it had increased to the extent that it could almost completely cover Luo Fan's world of laws. And the nature of the power itself had unknowingly increased to the extent that it surpassed the strongest power that a perfect world's founder could unleash at this point. The speed of the power's increase began to slow down again. The original speed of increase could be regarded as a turtle crawling, but the current speed could only be regarded as the crawling of a snail. However, the effect of this increase was also quite obvious. As the essence of this power rose to such a level, with the help of this power, the formation's ability to withstand the pressure released by the will of the world outside had unknowingly reached the stage of counterattack. It had actually started to continuously push outwards, and gradually, the space that was supported by the formation had actually started to slowly increase. This situation made the world's founders rejoice, but at the same time, they were on guard. They rejoiced because everything seemed to be so perfect and smooth. On the other hand, they were on guard because the world's will's performance was clearly different from the means that it had displayed in the past. This situation clearly meant that the world's will had some kind of plan that they didn't know about. This was clearly an enemy in the dark while they were in the open. How could the world's founders not be on guard? They weren't fools who only looked at what was in front of them. At this moment, as the cultivators were feeling extremely complicated, a huge array formation appeared in the surroundings of this huge array formation. It looked like the expansion of this formation, but it had the same effect as this formation. However, it completely enveloped this formation from the outside, and it appeared around this formation. In other words, it appeared within the vortex and almost completely overlapped with the vortex, making the huge vortex, which was originally the embodiment of the will of the world, look like it was completely formed by this huge array. So this is the reason why the worlds will want these fellow Taoists. At this moment, many worlds' founders came to a sudden realization. There is no need to explain the use of a formation that had the same effect as this one, even though it was a different method. Now, although this formation was used to restrain them, it seemed to be used purely to deal with the enemy. But in reality, this was only because of the situation. What was the original purpose of Luo Fan for these world's founders to construct this formation? His original goal was to obtain a power or might that was superior to the many founders of the world. Then they would use this power to break the balance of this world and completely break through it. At the very least, they would have to transcend this world. As for how this formation would clash with the worlds after it was formed, that was just a side effect. Similarly, if that was the fundamental purpose of this formation, then what was the purpose of the worlds using the many pioneers of the world that it had absorbed to create this formation? Clearly, his original objective was definitely similar to this formation. He wanted to obtain a power or might that surpassed the level of the many founders of the world. However, due to the difference in their standpoints, Luo Fan and the rest obtained this power to break the balance of this world and break through it or transcend. The world's will's purpose was clearly not to break through or transcend itself. Its purpose could only be to strengthen itself, improve itself, or even sublimate itself. As for using it to resist this formation, it could only be said to be the result of the situation. But that was not its fundamental purpose. The number of world's founders that Luo Fan had recruited was similar to the number of world's founders that were absorbed by the world's will. Therefore, at this moment, the formation that Luo Fan made the world's founders to construct was not much different from the formation that was constructed by the world's will. The reason why the formation constructed by the will of the heavens and earth was able to envelop the formation constructed by Luo Fan and the others was that the formation constructed by the will of the heavens and earth was similar in size. The fundamental reason was the existence of the world's will. That was because the will of the heavens and earth itself was already incomparably huge. It was enough to easily envelop the formation constructed by Luo Fan and the others. Since the world's will could envelop itself, then how could the formation created by the world's will and the other world's founders not be able to envelop the central formation? Chapter 2902. The space-time in front of him was supposed to be the residence of the world's will. However, at this moment, when Luo Fan appeared here, he discovered that the world's will that was supposed to be here had completely changed. It had become a vortex that exuded an extremely familiar aura. This aura, this appearance, was clearly the same as the world's will that was building a formation outside to suppress this island and the formation formed by the many world founders. Under such circumstances, it would be an insult to his intelligence if he were to say that the vortex in front of him had nothing to do with the world's will. Among them, the greatest possibility was that this vortex was the embodiment of the great world's will outside. This was also Luo Fan's judgment at this moment. At this moment, an extremely mysterious voice came from the vortex. You really discovered it. Following these words, the space-time trembled slightly, and the aura that belonged to the world's will that was originally extremely restrained began to strengthen endlessly. In the blink of an eye, it had already permeated this space-time and began to seep into the vast world outside. In just a flash, it had already filled the entire world of laws. Along with this change, an inexplicable resonance appeared between this world and the huge vortex outside, the two layers of formations in the outside world. Amidst such a resonance, all kinds of indescribable subtle forces directly penetrated all kinds of barriers and entered the world of laws. They began to erupt in a frenzy and constantly integrated into everything in the world of laws. They began to gradually distort this part of the world, causing this part of the world to produce an inexplicable repulsive force on Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. The three-legged cauldron in his hand trembled slightly, and an endless suppressive force instantly enveloped the entire island. This time, the suppressive force did not bypass the residents of the worlds like before. Instead, it directly penetrated into the residents of the world's will and instantly enveloped it. As this suppressive force covered the vortex, it became sluggish. All of the aura released from the vortex was completely erased, and the resonance caused by this aura also stopped completely at this moment. It's too late. At this moment, a voice suddenly entered Luo Fan's ears. Immediately afterward, the power related to the true sage, which had not moved for many years, suddenly moved. As if some power had touched it, that power squirmed slightly at this moment. As it squirmed, the suppressive force that originally filled, covered, and suppressed everything in this world completely lost its effect. At this moment, the suppressive force still existed, but everything that was suppressed by it seemed to have received some unimaginable blessing and completely ignored the effect of the suppressive force. Among them was the vortex that was the incarnation of the will of the great world in the outside world, which was not far from Luo Fan. At this moment, the vortex had completely broken free from a suppression force. It spun slowly as if nothing had changed. It constantly emitted its own aura and penetrated deeper and deeper into everything in the world. At the same time, endless power began to brew around Luo Fan's body. This power completely ignored the power of the three-legged cauldron in Luo Fan's hand and produced an increasingly powerful suppressive force that gradually affected the clone embodiment of Luo Fan. Sure enough, it's easy to obtain and easy to lose if it's just borrowing that power. At this moment, Luo Fan sighed inexplicably. As he sighed, Luo Fan, who seemed to be unable to do anything and could only watch helplessly as he was completely crushed by the boundless power, suddenly disappeared without a trace, as if he had never appeared in the first place. He gave up on this clone embodiment. At this moment, a bewildered voice came from the vortex. Clearly, the changes that had happened to Luo Fan had exceeded the scope of his understanding. Now that he had practically gained control over everything in this world of laws, he should be able to sense any changes that occurred here. However, the entire process of Luo Fan's disappearance just now was too mysterious, and unbelievable. Even though he had control over everything, he still couldn't discover any clues. How could he not be shocked? At this moment, an invisible palm appeared above the vortex out of thin air. With a grab, the essence of the existence of the vortex was instantly grasped. The entire process was so mysterious that it even exceeded the scope of understanding of ordinary living beings. Even the will of the world couldn't imagine why such a situation had occurred. This essence of existence represented the root of its existence. If this essence of existence was erased, then the clone embodiment of the will of the world would disappear completely. In fact, it might not even exist in the memories of other living beings. Perhaps even his main body would completely forget that this vortex had ever existed. This was the characteristic of the essence of existence. Of course, such a characteristic was not so easy to come into contact with. Normally speaking, even if a living being completely erased from its body, including its body, mind, and life essence, the essence of its existence would still exist. In other words, even if everything was erased, there would still be various traces left behind. There would still be people who would remember its existence, and it would still remain in the memories of those who had interacted with it. If one wanted to completely erase the essence of such an existence, One would need to possess a strength that was powerful enough to erase everything. After completely erasing the existence, one would continue to penetrate deeper and destroy it. Only when one reached a certain level would one be able to truly destroy the essence of such an existence. However, it was obvious that this palm wasn't using such a method at this moment. This palm seemed to have reached out from another plane. It directly ignored all obstacles, all defenses, and directly grasped the essence of the existence of this vortex. During this process, the endless power and might that the vortex originally possessed did not produce any effect at all. Do you know why I spent so much effort to set up this array formation? Luo Fan's voice sounded in the vortex's ears at this moment. Before the vortex could think, the essence of existence that had been grasped was instantly crushed, collapsed, and dissipated. It turned into nothingness as if it had never appeared in the first place. Between heaven and earth, everything became clear again. The might and power that had been guided by the vortex, the ruthless aura that permeated the entire world, and everything else had disappeared without a trace at this moment, as if they had never appeared in the first place. I did this precisely so that I could do this now. At this moment, Luo Fan's figure walked out of the void, and he waved his hand as he said this. Everything that happened just now was actually very simple. When he was about to be crushed by the endless power controlled by the vortex, he directly entered another plane and directly avoided all the disasters and misfortunes that happened in the real world. After that, he directly attacked in the plane of existence, directly attacking the essence of the existence of the vortex. As for why the attack on another plane could appear in this reality, the reason was also very simple. It was just that he displayed the attack of constructing a dimension that he had comprehended in the process of communicating with other seven tribulation experts on the Tao Master Path. As for why he did this superfluous move and used this attack of constructing a dimension to attack the vortex, the reason was very simple. Because if he did not do this, the attack on other planes was very likely to be ignored by the vortex. Don't forget that great heaven and earth had almost completely equalized many planes, making any plane become the same great heaven and earth. It was difficult to say that such an existence did not have the means to manipulate many planes. The attack on the plane of existence would indeed have an effect on the existence corresponding to the vortex in the plane of existence. It was indeed possible to erase the vortex on that level. However, that was only in that plane. In other planes, such as the plane of reality, it was uncertain whether he would also be erased because of such damage. In contrast, the situation was completely different if the attack in the plane of existence was directly materialized with the help of the attack of constructing a dimension and appeared in the plane of reality. There is also the essence of existence in the plane of reality, but it was not as pure as in the plane of existence. Under such circumstances, the attack on the essence of existence here would naturally achieve a fatal effect. Therefore, in the end, the vortex in the plane of reality was completely destroyed and disappeared without a trace, just like at this moment. The method of constructing a dimension seems to have an inexplicable connection with many planes. Recalling the previous attack, Luo Fan suddenly had an inexplicable understanding. The attacking method of constructing dimensions was to directly divide the opponent into countless parts, with each dimension having one or several corresponding parts. Then, through direct attacks in those dimensions, one could bypass the various defenses that originally existed on the opponent's body and directly attack the corresponding parts of the opponent, finally achieving the effect of attacking the opponent. And these many planes seem to be similar to the operation of dividing the existence. Of course, it was only similar. After all, the plane was not divided. Among the many planes, the plane of reality was obviously a relatively special plane. Perhaps in essence, there was no difference between it and the other planes. However, because of its tolerance to many existences, it seemed to be more important than many other planes. It could almost be regarded as the main plane of all living beings and all things. In fact, all other planes could actually find their own corresponding plane in the plane of reality. For example, the essence of existence that belonged to all things in the plane of existence could actually be found in the plane of reality. It was just that it was hidden among the endless other corresponding existences in the plane of existence. Similarly, the plane of karma, the plane of fate, the plane of illusion, and so on and so forth. Many corresponding planes, such as karma, fate, and illusion, were actually all contained in the plane of reality. In other words, the plane of reality was actually the product of everything else being intertwined together. Perhaps because of this, for existences who did not understand the relationship between the various planes, everything that happened in the plane of reality really happened. Everything that happened in the other planes did not happen at all. In fact, even the destruction of other planes would take a long time to be reflected in the plane of reality. In contrast, the attack that constructed a dimension was completely constructing a dimension in the plane of reality, dividing the corresponding existences in the plane of reality. Previously, Luo Fan did not have a deep understanding of this kind of division. He only stopped at the step of bypassing various protective measures and directly attacking the opponent's main body. But now, he suddenly realized that this attack that constructed a dimension seemed to be able to carry out a perfect combination with the attack of a plane. If the two were combined through the construction of different dimensions, the other planes and the plane of reality could be directly linked together. At that time, a random attack might be able to directly target the opponent's karma, fate, and the opponent's illusory essence, as well as the attack that Luo Fan used to target the opponent's existence essence, and so on and so forth. In just an instant, Luo Fan thought of countless ways to combine the two attacks. For a moment, he suddenly realized that everything seemed so fragile when he looked at everything again. Even the world creators seemed to only need a single thought from him to completely get rid of them. In fact, I don't even need to use this formation to recover the other planes. Then, such a thought flashed in his mind, and his emotions suddenly became inexplicably excited. One must know that the reason why he could use this method of combining dimensions and planes to attack the vortex at this moment, but he could not do it at all before, was actually because of the formation created by the world creators. Chapter 2903. In this great world, the reason why Luo Fan could not use the means to communicate with the various planes without any hindrance, even on the Tao Master Path, was not because those planes did not exist. It was because those planes had been covered by the reality plane, and everything on all planes was equal to everything on the reality plane. Because everything on all planes was equal to everything on the reality plane, any development on the reality plane would also be replicated on many other planes at the same time. That was to say, in the reality plane, whatever Luo Fan encountered, what kind of treatment, what kind of dangers, what kind of oppression he encountered, then he would also encounter the same dangers, the same oppression, and the same treatment on many other planes. In this way, it was obvious that if he could not resist in the reality plane, he could not resist in the other planes either. If he was obliterated in the reality plane, then he would also be obliterated in many other planes. In this way, the existence of the other planes naturally did not exist for him. Of course, he could not use the existence of the other planes to complete the various divine senses, powers, and means that he had built before. However, this time, when he realized that the dimensional construction method could be combined with many planes, he knew that even if he returned to the outside world, where many other planes had been replicated by the reality plane, he could still easily do what he had done just now. After all, although many planes had been replicated by the reality plane, they were still those planes in essence. This kind of essence could only be changed when the will of heaven and earth could truly achieve absolute control of the infinite planes. Obviously, the will of heaven and earth obviously did not have this ability. Therefore, even if it was transformed into the appearance of the reality plane, the essence of those planes would not change. Since the essence would not change, the corresponding relationship between those planes and the existence in the reality plane would naturally not change. This correspondence would not change. Now, the methods that Luo Fan had comprehended could be used without any hindrance. Just as Luo Fan was deep in thought, all of a sudden, outside the island, or in other words, outside the world of laws, the formation that had enveloped the island and formed a barrier against space-time to resist the vortex outside, or rather, the pressure from the will of the heavens and earth, suddenly froze. This stagnation was not caused by the pressure of the outside world. Instead, it was a kind of stagnation that came from the inside out. In other words, it wasn't an external force that caused the formation to freeze. Instead, it was the existences that had constructed the formation, the many creators of the world, that had caused the formation to stagnate. Luo Fan frowned slightly. This change seemed to indicate that something was amiss. He focused his attention on the outside of the island and also connected to the incarnation in the formation. In an instant, he could sense the changes in the formation even more clearly. All the world creators in the entire formation, regardless of whether they were perfect world creators or ordinary world creators, had fallen into a state of confusion. It was as if there was an incomparably huge problem that was pestering them, making them unable to focus on the formation at all. Luo Fan frowned deeply. This situation was obviously the work of the will of the heavens and earth. If one or two world creators fell into this state, it might be because they had discovered something or encountered some problem. However, millions of world creators had fallen into this state, so it was obviously impossible for it to be spontaneous. There was definitely an external force at work. And now, to them, the external force could only be the will of the heavens and earth outside. You seem to have said something. Luo Fan frowned and said to the vortex that had almost covered everything in the sky. The vortex was spinning slowly at this moment, but it did not say anything. Luo Fan suddenly understood what the other party had said to the world creators at this moment. A perfect world creator looked at Luo Fan. His eyes were filled with disbelief, confusion, pain, and deep despair. Even Luo Fan felt an inexplicable sense of pressure when he was being stared at like that. At this moment, the perfect world creator spoke. Is what he said true? This piece of primal chaos is completely your fate? Are we really just born as tribulations? Is the mission of our existence to create an environment that can obstruct you? Are we defying the heavens by helping you? Luo Fan finally let out a long sigh when he heard this. As expected, the will of the heavens and earth had really informed the world creators about this. It was no wonder that the world creators would have such a change at this moment. If someone had told him that he was specially created to be someone's tribulation, that the world he knew and everything he had experienced was just a derivation of that tribulation, and that everything was fake, he would probably not have behaved any better than the world creators. He immediately sighed and said, "Haven't you all confirmed it? Would you all believe me if I said no?" Hearing this, the last bit of wishful thinking of the perfect world creator was finally destroyed. The tiny bit of hope that he had left also disappeared without a trace. Who would have thought that everything was fake? The world we created, everything we experienced before, it turns out that it was all fake. The creator of the perfect world murmured. He completely gave up on the formation and turned to leave. Following his actions, a large number of world creators also made the same choice. They completely gave up on the formation and turned to leave. As they made their choices, the formation that was already under unimaginable pressure completely collapsed. Endless cracks appeared on the formation, causing it to shatter. Unknowingly, it had completely collapsed. What also collapsed along with the formation was the space-time that was created by the formation, or rather, the space-time that was separated from the Great World. This area of space-time was disappearing even faster than the formation. When the formation had just collapsed, that space-time had yet to collapse. However, before the formation had completely collapsed, that space-time had already disappeared without a trace. As it collapsed, the various subtle environments created by this space-time, such as the environment where many levels returned to normal, were also erased. The truth is the truth after all. No matter how hard you try to hide it, you can't hide it. At this moment, a voice came from a void. It was the voice of the will of the heavens and earth. Although he had easily disintegrated the wills of the world creators and made them unable to resist him, the will of the heavens and earth didn't show any signs of complacency. It was as if everything he had done, everything he had said, and all the changes that had taken place now were incomparably natural changes. The will of the heavens and earth didn't make things difficult for the departure of the world creators. Even the inward pressure directly bypassed them, allowing them to pass through the array formation outside and the vortex as if they were passing through a shadow, leaving this place of trouble. Do you guys really intend to become enemies with me? Luo Fan didn't pay attention to the world creators that had left. Instead, he turned his gaze to the world creators that had stayed behind. The world creators that had left occupied about half of the world creators that Luo Fan had gathered. In other words, there was still about half of the world creators that had stayed behind. Clearly, the remaining world creators weren't here to continue their original task of helping Luo Fan resist the pressure from the will of the heavens and earth outside. At the very least, he couldn't see any signs of that from their furious and hateful gazes. The reason why the world creators had stayed behind wasn't that they didn't care about the news that the will of the heavens and earth told them, but that they intended to make Luo Fan pay the price for deceiving them. In other words, they intended to carry out the task that the chaos simulation had given them, which was to attack Luo Fan, destroy Luo Fan, and obliterate Luo Fan. Could it be that the will of the heavens and earth was watching their choice? At this moment, the will of the heavens and earth had already taken action. The formation outside the vortex slowly extended its tentacles and began to connect the world creators to the formation. As the world creators were connected, the formation's power began to increase bit by bit. By the time the world creators were connected to the formation's power had already increased by at least twofold. Due to the collapse of the formation, the many threads that had been blocking the power of the formation from fusing into the vortex had disappeared without a trace, and the power of the formation had increased by at least twofold. Due to this, the vortex seemed to have suddenly risen a level, and the aura it gave off became even more terrifying. If Luo Fan hadn't covered the entire world with his suppressive power, the terrifying pressure alone would have been enough to make the world collapse or even annihilate it completely. Die. Although the reason for our existence will be gone once you die, this is the mission of our existence. I really hope that you can hold on for a little longer. At this moment, the will of the heavens and earth spoke. Along with this voice, endless power gathered towards the vortex from all directions. As the power converged, the pressure that was already incomparably terrifying to begin with began to skyrocket. The nature of the vortex also began to rise endlessly along with the surge of power. Under this change, the suppressive power released by the three-legged cauldron constructed by Luo Fan's incarnation also began to tremble slightly, vaguely showing signs of being unable to withstand the pressure. At this moment, Luo Fan only sighed slightly. As expected, you're actually waiting for me to improve, but how would you know how much I've improved this time? At this moment, he suddenly understood the will of the heavens and earth's thoughts. The will of the heavens and earth's previous actions seemed to be bent on destroying him, but in fact, it had left some leeway in each of its actions. If he could seize this leeway, he would be able to launch a certain counterattack. Of course, it would only be a certain counterattack. Perhaps this counterattack could slightly stop the will of the heavens and earth and prolong him, but couldn't truly defeat the will of the heavens and earth, nor could it transcend the simulated chaos. The reason why it did this was because the will of the heavens and earth clearly understood the nature of its existence. It understood that it could only exist longer if Luo Fan could last longer. Just like before, was Luo Fan's act of gathering so many founders really unstoppable? I'm afraid not. But in the end, he managed to gather so many world founders without a hitch. He had even confronted the will of the heavens and earth. He would not believe that it wasn't the will of the heavens and earth that had intentionally facilitated all of this. And now, what Luo Fan had comprehended had clearly exceeded the will of the heavens and earth's expectations, So the will of the heavens and earth had no choice but to increase its power to suppress him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have told the founders the truth that could have been made clear a long time ago. Fighting against an existence like you makes me feel quite uncomfortable. Luo Fan looked at the huge vortex, raised his hand, and blasted out a punch. The punch seemed extremely simple and ordinary, but when it was thrown out, it naturally passed through all obstacles and smashed into the center of the vortex, striking the indescribable essence of the vortex. It was a similar concept and an essence that was similar to existence. As the indescribable essence was struck, the vortex trembled and collapsed. Along with the collapse of the vortex, the formation created by the many founders of the world to strengthen the existence of the vortex also collapsed. With the collapse of these two things, the world became clear once more. Chapter 2904. When the world cleared up once more, the world founders still couldn't react. They hovered in the air, looking at everything around them with baffled expressions. They had no idea what had just happened. Everything that had happened was simply unimaginable to them. That was the world's will. It could be said to be a supreme existence in this world. Even if they gathered together, they would still be insignificant compared to it. However, such an existence had suddenly collapsed in the face of Luo Fan's move that they couldn't understand at all. Moreover, the collapse was extremely thorough, as if it had been wiped out in an instant. Even a normal process of collapse could not be maintained. How could they understand such a situation? Fellow Taoists, you may leave, Luo Fan said calmly to the other cultivators. There was no smile on his face, nor was there any anger. It was as if the world founders hadn't done anything before this. Of course, it was also as if the world founders didn't have any relations with him before this. He naturally understood that the world founders were his enemies and wanted to deal with him together with the world's will. After all, the very nature of the world founders' existence determined that they would naturally stand against Luo Fan. It was only natural that they would fall out with him after knowing the truth. But obviously, although he understood their choice, he wouldn't treat them wholeheartedly. Since they had made such a choice, then whatever friendship they had before would naturally vanish into thin air. Leave? Where can we go if we leave this place? One of the perfect world founders sighed. That's your problem. Luo Fan simply said that. If they still had relations, he would naturally not be stingy with his saliva to console them and get rid of their negative attitudes. However, it was clear that the friendship that they had built up previously had completely disappeared at this moment. Why would Luo Fan waste his saliva to console them if he wasn't being pretentious? The fact that he did not erase the world founders at this moment could already be considered as him being benevolent and still remembering their previous relations. After experiencing the changes that overturned their worldview, the world founders had regained their rationality. They were world founders, after all, and not ordinary cultivators. Their rationality had been temporarily overshadowed by their emotions, but it was only temporary. It was impossible for it to be permanent. After regaining their rationality, the feelings of abandonment from before naturally couldn't affect them anymore. Some world founders opened their mouths, wanting to say something to Luo Fan, but they didn't say anything in the end. They sighed and turned to leave one after another. In just a short period of time, the region had become empty, and there were no other world founders apart from Luo Fan. As for where the creators of the world had gone and what fortuitous encounters they had after that, Luo Fan couldn't be bothered to care. At this moment, he turned his gaze to the sky. The original body of this world was the tribulation level. If it was the original structure, it would naturally be almost impossible for Luo Fan to find the residents of the worlds given his ability. After all, the structure of the tribulation level was too profound and complicated. Given Luo Fan's level, it was impossible for him to detect all the details, so it was naturally difficult for him to find any location or form of the world's will. However, since the tribulation level had turned into this world, the situation was clearly different. As a world, it naturally had to conform to the basic laws of the world, and its structure naturally had to conform to the basic structure of ordinary worlds. It was easy to imagine how familiar Luo Fan was with the world. Even though this world was incomparably great and was different from any other world he had seen before, he could still grasp some of the basic structure that belonged to this world. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to discover the changes that occurred after the world devoured the many worlds that simulated the state of chaos and discovered the similar changes in his world of laws by walking around in this world. Therefore, at this moment, although there were many obstacles, he finally discovered the strange space-time that existed in this world. It was a space-time that was hidden in the depths of the endless space-time that belonged to the world's will. Even though the world's will in this world was countless times stronger than the world's wills in the world of laws and countless other worlds, it still couldn't reach the level of the world's will in the true state of chaos due to the restriction of the simulated state of chaos. This kind of level restriction made it impossible for the world's will to be completely untraceable, much less omnipotent. Naturally, its residents still couldn't compare to the residents of the true world's will. There were still all kinds of traces that were revealed. This was also the fundamental reason why Luo Fan could easily discover the residents of the world's will at this moment. Of course, this discovery would actually be useless in the past. After all, even if the world's will was placed in front of him, there was nothing he could do. This was because although the world's will wasn't at a high level, its volume was too huge. This volume was already enough to replace the huge difference in quality. Facing such a volume, even if it was Luo Fan, he could only watch it wreak havoc. He wouldn't be able to use any effective means to stop it. Even the incarnation that he condensed with the help of the power related to the true sage couldn't possibly be effective against the world's will. Perhaps Luo Fan had previously condensed a three-legged cauldron with the help of the incarnation and activated a suppressive force that was enough to render the world's will helpless, protecting his world of laws for a long time. This would make people mistakenly think that this suppressive force could easily defeat the world's will. However, in reality, if the world's will was only as large as the incarnation it had displayed before, this suppressive force would indeed be able to easily subdue it. Unfortunately, the true volume of the world's will was hundreds of millions of times larger than the incarnation it had displayed. Even the three-legged cauldron was only able to suppress an insignificant portion of such a massive body. Suppressing that insignificant small part of the will of heaven and earth had no effect on the will of heaven and earth as a whole. Perhaps the world's will could even use this suppressive force to restrain the incarnation and bypass the defensive means of the incarnation to directly target his true body. It was precisely because he knew this that Luo Fan didn't use such a method to directly target the world's will. Naturally, he didn't search for the residents of the world's will. At this moment, he looked at the residents of the world's will and knew that his previous choice was correct. The size of the space-time where the world's will resided was even beyond his imagination. Even with his perception and eyesight, he couldn't see the size of the space-time at all. In front of that space-time, the world of laws was simply like an ant on a planet. In fact, the disparity might even be greater than that. Even if he activated all the suppressive force that his incarnation could activate, the range that it could cover was only a billionth of the world's will. A billionth of anything was obviously insignificant compared to the whole. It was impossible for it to have much impact on the overall situation. If he had really used the suppressive force as confidence to directly deal with the residents of the world's will, the final result would definitely have been failure. It's so huge and so terrifying. I wonder if the new technique I've comprehended will be effective. At this moment, he even began to hesitate in his heart. The space-time in front of him was simply too vast and too tough. Even though he felt that he had comprehended the ability to construct dimensions and combine other levels, he actually didn't have much confidence that this ability would have any effect on this space-time. Of course, this doubt wouldn't stop Luo Fan. Since there was hope and he had a method, how could he give up without giving it a try? At this moment, he raised his hand and pointed at that space-time. In an instant, a finger that was hundreds of billions of light years in diameter suddenly appeared in that space-time and slowly poked at that space-time. During this process, there seemed to be some kind of shadow that gradually separated from that space-time and was slowly approached by the finger that was beyond any living being's imagination. An invisible sound rang out the moment the two came into contact. Although this sound was invisible, it had an unimaginable penetrative power. In just an instant, all living beings in this entire world with perception instantly heard this sound and couldn't help but turn their gazes to the sky in the direction where the sound came from. At this moment, the finger that had a cross-section of hundreds of billions of light years in diameter had already completely punctured the shadow that separated from that space-time, causing it to completely collapse and turn into endless fragments that gradually disappeared into nothingness. As the shadow was punctured, large areas of the space-time collapsed like dominoes and continuously spread in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had already spread to a terrifying area that was hundreds of millions of times wider than the diameter of the finger itself. However, as time passed, the collapse began to gradually slow down. When it spread to an area that was close to 1 trillion times the size of the finger, the collapse finally stopped completely. Clearly, the collapse could only reach such a vast area. This kind of area was absolutely fatal to any world. This was a perfect world that simulated the state of chaos. Even if there were thousands of worlds piled up there, it would definitely not be able to fill it up. However, such an area was still insignificant compared to the vast space-time that was the residence of the world's will. In fact, it couldn't even be considered an injury to that space-time, let alone completely collapse it. As expected, it still doesn't work. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan could only sigh inwardly. It must be known that this attack of his could already be said to be the strongest attack that he could unleash at the moment. Moreover, its area of effect was enough to make any creator of a perfect world feel despair. In fact, even if he used it in the true state of chaos, such an attack would definitely be extremely impressive. However, in the face of this space-time that was purely suppressing everything with its size, the worlds will ultimately still couldn't handle it. Just as he was sighing inwardly, the space-time squirmed slightly, and the area that was punctured by the huge, illusory finger began to gradually shrink. Unknowingly, it had already been compressed by a small half. Clearly, because this kind of damage did not completely destroy the space-time, it was still within the scope of the self-recovery ability of the space-time. As long as there was no continuous damage, the space-time could quickly recover. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan frowned slightly. How could he just watch the space-time recover to its original state? If that was the case, wouldn't everything that he did before be just a joke? With a thought, he raised his hand to form a seal and pressed it in the direction of the space-time above the void. Along with his action, a circular illusory seal that was also hundreds of billions of light years in diameter directly appeared in the center of the collapsed space-time and pressed down on the collapsed area. Along with this seal, countless lines emerged out of thin air from the position of the seal. They continuously spread and intertwined in the gap, and in the blink of an eye, they had already turned into a huge, strange seal that completely blocked the self-recovery ability of that space-time. The pressure that the intact space-time exerted on the gap gradually stopped, and the gap finally stopped shrinking. Chapter 29:05. If this was a world that was truly in a state of chaos, the residents of the worlds would only be a relatively hidden space-time, and there would not be anything too special about it. However, it was clear that this place was not truly in a state of chaos. This place was a simulated state of chaos. There was no real world's will here, and all the world's wills were simulated by gathering all the spirituality in the world. Even if the world's will in this world was very likely to be the incarnation of the tribulation level's will, or the incarnation of the will that simulated the state of chaos, it was still the same after it became the world's will. All the spirituality in the world gathered in the residence of the world's will, and an indescribably complex structure was carried out in that residence. In the end, It was sublimated into something that was similar to the real world's will, a simulated world's will. This could be seen from the situation in the residents of the perfect worlds that Luo Fan had seen back then. Therefore, compared to the residents of the real world's will, the residents of the world's will in the simulated state of chaos was even more inseparable from the simulated world's will. In this way, the damage to the space-time was naturally not just the damage to the space-time. The damage to the space-time would definitely be reflected on the world's will, and then on this world. At this moment, as the damaged space-time was suppressed by the seal and could not be restored, various changes gradually occurred in this world. Among them, the core of the change was where Luo Fan was at this moment. This was not a coincidence, but it was inevitable. This was because the location where the space-time was damaged was directly opposite here. The real space-time was naturally not as simple as ordinary spatial locations. It was not a straight line that was directly opposite. In fact, that space-time was hidden in the depths of this world. Even from Luo Fan's point of view, it seemed like a continent floating in the void, but in reality, it was only a manifestation after Luo Fan's will, perspective, and perception processed it. In fact, that space-time and this world were actually two completely different space-times. In other words, that space-time and this world actually did not have a real spatial connection. If one did not have the ability to transcend space-time and did not have the means to travel across space-time, no matter how fast one was or how powerful one was, it was impossible to travel in any direction in this world and come into contact with that space-time. In this way, one could see what kind of distance the straight-line distance between that space-time and where Luo Fan was. It was actually the closest distance in terms of the degree of closeness between the space-time and the space-time. In other words, it was the place where Luo Fan's location was the closest to the space-time where the will of the world resided. It was also the place with the shortest distance between the two. It was also the first place where the attack could land if it was pointed in a straight line. In other words, the finger that Luo Fan had condensed before was pointing at the location of the spirituality in that space-time that corresponded to Luo Fan's current location. That spot had been destroyed and destroyed, which obviously meant that the spirituality in the area where Luo Fan was located had been destroyed and destroyed. In this way, after the location of that space-time was destroyed, the area that changed in this world was naturally where Luo Fan was at this moment, as well as the area where this world of laws was located. At this moment, everything in this area did not lose their spirituality or vitality because of the destruction of the spirituality in that space-time. On the contrary, because of that change, this area seemed to have broken free from some kind of shackles, and it became more and more lively. Although the spirituality that gathered in that space-time was the spirituality of everything in this world, it obviously did not mean that the spirituality there really corresponded to everything in this world. At the very least, it did not mean that everything in this world would completely lose their spirituality after the spirituality there was destroyed. In fact, the situation was actually the complete opposite. Everything in this world was equivalent to the tree roots, and the spirituality in that space-time was equivalent to the branches and leaves. The branches and leaves were naturally quite important. If the branches and leaves changed, it would also affect the tree roots and change the way the tree roots grew. It might even cause the tree roots to dry up. However, this did not mean that the destruction of the branches and leaves would directly cause the destruction of the tree roots. In particular, the destruction of the branches and leaves that were bound was even more so. The spirituality in that space-time was obviously the branches and leaves that were bound. The existence of these branches and leaves was actually constantly twisting the tree roots, causing the tree roots to unknowingly start to grow and extend in that twisted way. Under such circumstances, the destruction of the spirituality actually meant that the binding had suddenly disappeared without a trace. If all the branches and leaves were destroyed, it would naturally be a great deal of damage to the tree roots. It would even be enough to make the tree roots unable to grow enough branches and leaves, absorb enough sunlight, and produce enough nutrients to support the growth of the tree roots. However, In a situation where only a portion of the branches and leaves were destroyed, and a large portion of the twisted branches and leaves still existed, the tree roots would naturally have enough nutrients to support their growth. In this way, the destruction of the branches and leaves naturally wouldn't cause too much damage to the tree roots. Instead, it allowed the tree roots to gain freedom, allowing them to freely grow the branches and leaves that were most suitable for them, freeing them from their original restraints. This was also the fundamental reason why the region that Luo Fan was in was freed from some kind of shackles and became more lively and carefree. At this moment, this change continued to spread outwards, and in the end, it even spread to an area that was billions of light years away. This region had even covered the region that Luo Fan had walked through when he rescued the world pioneers. Although, compared to the entire world, this region was still insignificant. The size of this region clearly corresponded to the size of the space-time above, which was the residence of the world's will that was damaged. In that space-time, the size of the region that was damaged was obviously similar to the size of this region. It's a pity that I still can't transcend. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan had a slight look of regret on his face. Although this region was already extremely vast, so much so that it was countless times vaster than any other large world, it was still only a small region in this world. Its size was enough to move around, but it still couldn't occupy much weight in this world. It was still insufficient to rely on the power of this region to transcend this world. Sighing inwardly, his heart moved slightly, and the island that was the world of laws began to slowly expand. Although this island was astonishingly huge, it was still just an island in the end. Compared to the true size of the world of laws, it seemed extremely insignificant. Evidently, the world of laws existed in the form of this island because it was the result of an extremely shocking compression. If it was in the past, Luo Fan naturally wouldn't have the thought of expanding the world of laws. After all, once it was expanded, it would be many times more difficult for him to protect it than before. But clearly, at this moment, after he seized this region from the world's will, the situation was completely different. After seizing this region, what he needed to guard against was this region, not this island. In this way, expanding the island, or rather expanding the world of laws, no longer increased the difficulty of defending. Since that was the case, he naturally wouldn't continue to let his world of laws suffer. Very quickly, the world of laws expanded thousands of times, growing from the original appearance of an island to the appearance of a vast continent. And this was just the beginning. Just how vast was the world of laws? This was something that almost no one but Luo Fan could explain clearly. At this moment, when he expanded the world of laws without any scruples, the speed at which the world of laws grew naturally exceeded the imagination of almost all existences. Just like that, after a few days, the entire world had expanded to the extent of trillions of light years. Even so, it still wasn't enough to completely expand the world of laws. At most, it could only expand a part of the main body of the world. As the world of laws expanded, the surrounding seawater began to churn and was frantically devoured by the world of laws. The seawater itself was formed from the power of tribulations. Originally, the power of the tribulations was under the control of the will of the heavens and the earth. Although they were tamed, once they were agitated, they would definitely erupt with destructive force and destroy the existence of the surging seawater. But after it broke free from the shackles of the world's will, the situation was completely different. After it broke free from the shackles of the world's will, it had completely broken free from the fate of being a tribulations, and it had completely turned into a special kind of seawater. No matter how much such seawater was agitated, it could no longer release the power of the tribulations. It would only release the power of the special seawater. In this way, the seawater could be safely absorbed and used. Currently, the world of law was constantly absorbing the seawater and turning the seawater into nutrients for the growth of the world of law. This allowed the world of law to continuously expand and strengthen during this process. The original world of laws could only be considered an incomplete and perfect world of laws at most. After all, it had only survived 3 great tribulations as it continued to absorb seawater and turn it into resources for growth. Its original deficiencies began to be gradually made up for. The characteristics of perfection also became stronger, more and more complete, and more perfect. No matter what, the seawater was formed from the power of the tribulations. The benefits obtained after surviving the great tribulations were also formed from the power of the tribulations. In this way, devouring the seawater was naturally equivalent to devouring the various benefits obtained after surviving the great tribulations. In this way, it was easy to imagine what kind of benefits the world of laws could obtain from this devouring. As the characteristics of the world of laws continued to strengthen and improve, the force related to the true sage in the core of the world of laws also began to squirm slightly. There was actually a vague feeling of stretching. It was apparent that this force was rather satisfied with the changes in the perfect attribute. This expansion lasted for several years. Several years later, on a certain day, a faint rumble reverberated throughout the entire world of laws. Following that, the process of the expansion that had lasted for several years came to a complete stop, and the entire world of laws finally obtained a long-awaited peace. "I've finally reached the limit," Luo Fan thought to himself at this moment. At this moment, he looked at the residents of the world's will of the world. There, countless spirituality gathered again, and the worlds will begin to gradually be born again. The existence of the worlds was necessary for any world. No matter how many times it was destroyed, as long as the world still existed, the worlds would definitely be born again. It was the same for this world of laws. However, the current world's will of the world of laws was already completely different from the incarnation of the great world's will outside. At this moment, the world's will could vaguely see some resemblance to Luo Fan, and even Luo Fan could feel an indescribable intimacy coming from it. Obviously, such a world will no longer had anything to do with the great world's will in the outside world. Now, it had become a pure world's will of the world of laws. Although the will of the heavens and earth looked a little like Luo Fan, in reality, it was currently ignorant. Although it was the world's will, it only had instincts and could only operate according to the rules and laws set by Luo Fan. It couldn't even communicate with it. It could be said that it was an existence that was extremely similar to the true world's will. Chapter 2906. The current size of this world hadn't reached the limit of this region that had broken free from the shackles. At most, it was only equivalent to about 1/10,000th of this region. However, this was already the limit that this world of laws could expand to. It wasn't that it couldn't continue to expand, but if it continued to expand, it wouldn't be able to maintain the perfection and solidification of this world of laws. In other words, this was already the normal size of this world of laws. If it continued to expand, it would be equivalent to an ordinary cultivator performing a cultivation technique or ability to expand their body. Although it could also achieve the effect of expansion, it was obvious that it consumed power, and energy to maintain it. Such a method of transformation was clearly meaningless to the laws of the world. This was why Luo Fan said that it had reached its limit. At the same time that the world of laws reached its limit, the energy related to the true sage in the core of the world of laws, which was originally quite active, stabilized at this moment. However, the area that it occupied had expanded by thousands of times compared to before. It wasn't that the power itself had expanded by thousands of times, but the space-time it existed in had expanded by thousands of times. Moreover, it wasn't just the expansion of space. In many other aspects, this space-time had also expanded by thousands of times. It seemed that there was a huge difference compared to what it looked like in the beginning. What happened just now? At this moment, in the world of laws, many heaven and earth founders that were originally part of the transportation network layer woke up. These world founders have been turned into statues because they had touched the suppressive force that Luo Fan had unleashed. They had been suppressed by the suppressive force, which had turned them into statues. Now, after many changes, the suppression power had disappeared without trace. These heaven and earth founders naturally didn't have to continue to be suppressed by the suppression power, and they could naturally recover completely. Of course, the truth was that the suppression power had disappeared a long time ago, and their awakening was actually already a long time late. As for why it was so late, it was naturally because during this period of time, this world was in a state of expansion and transformation, and it instinctively suppressed all existences that might obstruct this expansion and transformation. In other words, the heaven and earth founders. Until now, when the expansion and transformation of this world was completed, the suppression finally disappeared completely, allowing them to wake up completely. The world has become different. The other heaven and earth founders looked at the surrounding world thoughtfully. They were extremely curious about what had happened to the surrounding world after they were suppressed. If they were existences that had transformed along with this world, they definitely wouldn't have noticed the huge changes that had taken place in this world. After all, if they transformed along with this world, their senses would naturally also transform along with it. No matter what changes happen around them, it would naturally be extremely natural and normal in their eyes. However, it was precisely because this wasn't the case for them, but because they were suppressed and didn't participate in this transformation process at all. Hence, they naturally wouldn't be affected by this transformation. Their senses would still remain in the state before they were transformed. In this way, they would naturally be able to discover the changes that this world had undergone in the entire transformation process at a glance. What is he trying to do? The only perfect heaven and earth founder also returned to his senses at this moment. At this moment, he frowned deeply and carefully searched for Luo Fan who had appeared in his senses previously. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan was no longer in his original position. He wanted to lock onto Luo Fan's position by observing his original position, but of course, it was impossible for him to succeed. It seems that a parallel place has appeared. I can feel the traces left behind by my incarnation. Suddenly, a heaven and earth founder said. At this moment, all the heaven and earth founders no longer had any thoughts of being hostile to each other. Now, the most important thing was obviously to figure out what exactly happened in this world and how it would affect them. Apart from that, everything else was obviously secondary to them. Even their hatred for the perfect heaven and earth founder was the same. At this moment, Luo Fan naturally wouldn't care about these heaven and earth founders. These heaven and earth founders had already become insignificant to him. Now, if he wanted to, he could instantly wipe out all the heaven and earth founders with a slap. At this moment, his incarnation took a light step forward, and his figure had already left the world of laws and arrived at the border of the world of laws. The surroundings were completely different from before. Although it was still seawater, it was no longer lifeless like before. Instead, it was filled with endless vitality. In the past, although the seawater was turbulent and looked like an ordinary ocean in the world, it was just more majestic and magnificent. However, there were almost no living beings in it, except for the beings that were derived from a certain world. But now, after breaking free from the shackles of the will of heaven and earth, the seawater had regained its original instincts. However, due to the uneven distribution of energy, countless living beings were born in it. There are all kinds of fish, aquatic animals, aquatic plants, and even bacteria, viruses, and so on. The surrounding seawater was densely packed together. At a glance, this ocean was no longer lifeless like before. In fact, when Luo Fan focused slightly, he discovered that there seemed to be some intelligent living beings being born in the depths of the sea. These intelligent living beings were obviously very different from other living beings. The moment their intelligence was born, they naturally began to absorb endless energy from the outside world and began to work hard to promote their own ascension. This was already the beginning of cultivation. In other words, there were cultivators brewing in this vast and boundless ocean. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan revealed a faint smile on his face. This situation meant that it would be very difficult for the will of heaven and earth to seize this ocean again. These cultivators that were brewing would become a great help in fighting against the will of heaven and earth. After all, these cultivators could only be born after breaking free from the shackles of the will of heaven and earth. Once they were controlled by the will of heaven and earth again, and shackled by the will of heaven and earth, these cultivators would lose their intelligence and become the kind of existence that could not see the world clearly, the laws, and the great Tao clearly. This was obviously something that no cultivator could accept. It was precisely because of this that as long as these cultivators were born, they would definitely wholeheartedly fight against the will of heaven and earth. Currently, these cultivators were only brewing, and there were not many powerful ones among them. However, this was only the beginning. As long as there was enough time, they would eventually grow. Compared to the outside world, this area was clearly more natural. The many other planes here were also doing their own thing, but they were no longer completely distorted and assimilated by the plane of reality like before, completely turning into the appearance of the plane of reality. Currently, the many planes that should be concepts were concepts, those that should exist were existences, and those that should be illusory were illusory. There were various kinds of them, but they were not much different from the normal planes of the world. With a thought, his figure flashed, and he had already traversed a distance of who knew how many trillions of light years, directly arriving at the border of this area. In other words, he was at the border of the sea that had broken free from the shackles and was still shackled. Here, the difference between breaking free from the shackles and not breaking free from the shackles was extremely obvious. Although there was no tangible barrier between the two to establish the existence of the border, the difference was extremely obvious. On this side of the border, everything was full of vitality. Endless creatures existed in the seawater and on the surface of the sea. On the other side of the boundary, although the seawater did not seem to be much different on the surface, it was only a thin line away from the boundary. On the outside, it had already become lifeless, without a trace of life. In fact, there were even some living beings that crossed the boundary, crossing from one side to the other. They would die on the spot, instantly disintegrated by the boundless power in the endless seawater, turning into countless fragments that fused with the seawater. As the seawater surged, they would disappear without a trace. Of course, such creatures were extremely rare. After all, living creatures had survival instincts. This instinct made them try their best to stay away from danger. As long as they crossed that line, they would die. If ordinary creatures had a choice, why would they enter it? Only those who had reached a dead end or were unfamiliar with the boundaries and had taken the wrong path. Otherwise, the creatures that appeared before Luo Fan's eyes right now, those who had died because they had crossed the boundary, would not have appeared in front of him. At this moment, on the other side of the border, a vortex appeared out of thin air. The vortex spun. The entire vortex suddenly expanded and shrank. It felt like a reel. I was staring at Luo Fan. At this moment, the eye was trying its best to adjust its line of sight. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan had an indescribable expression on his face. He said, "Is there anything else you want to say? I underestimated you. I didn't expect you to be able to comprehend this kind of god art." A voice that Luo Fan was familiar with came from the vortex. It was the voice of the world's will. Clearly, this vortex was the embodiment of the great world's will. There's nothing strange about this. In fact, I've already grasped the prerequisites. I only need to string them together to achieve this god art. Even if I don't comprehend it now, I'll definitely comprehend it in the future, Luo Fan said calmly. He wasn't just spouting nonsense. The method that he used to destroy such a large area of space-time where the world will resided was a method that was born from the combination of communicating with various planes and constructing dimensions. Although this method was extremely brilliant, had great potential, and was extremely powerful, in reality, with the various resources that he possessed, even if he did not comprehend this method of combining them this time, he would definitely comprehend it after some time. It was just that the time might not be accurate. After all, the foundation was there. With Luo Fan's intelligence, it was impossible for him to never discover the possibility of combining these two. Once this possibility was discovered, the god art would naturally be born. The vortex shrunk and said after a long time, "I won't let you cross this line. If you won't let me cross it, we'll have to see if you have the ability to do so," Luo Fan said calmly. The vortex did not reply and slowly dissipated. He was obviously not interested in shooting his mouth off. Since he had already expressed his intentions, he naturally had no interest in continuing to shoot his mouth off with Luo Fan. Luo Fan shook his head slightly. He looked up at the sky and the space-time that existed in the depths of space-time where the worlds were resided. This was because his position had changed. When he looked up, he saw that he was pointing straight at a damaged edge of the space-time where the worlds were resided. Due to the source of spirituality, the place where the worlds were resided was most closely connected to this location, which was the damaged edge. This also coincided with the location of the boundary between the inside and the outside. With a slight thought, he raised his hand and pointed at that location. As he pointed, another illusory finger with a diameter of hundreds of billions of light years appeared out of thin air under the space-time and jabbed at it. Just as the finger was on its way, an illusory figure began to slowly separate from the space-time. It seemed to be moving toward the finger. At this moment, the space-time where the worlds were resided shook violently. An indescribably terrifying power converged from all directions, and in the blink of an eye, it had already pulled the slowly emerging illusory figure back into the space-time. Puff, the finger, which had a cross-section diameter of hundreds of billions of light years, stabbed into the space-time, producing a circle of subtle ripples that spread in all directions. However, the space-time was not damaged at all. Chapter 29:07. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan only sighed slightly. It was actually extremely normal that the same method could not continue to work on that space-time and could not continue to destroy the world's will. After all, he was facing the world's will that was likely to be the embodiment of the tribulation level's will, and it might even be the embodiment of the world's will that simulated the state of chaos. How could such an existence not be prepared at all after being hit once? Although he still did not know how the other party resisted his attack, it was obviously extremely normal for the other party to really resist his attack. Of course, this did not mean that Luo Fan would give up just like that. In fact, he had only made a start by combining the attack method of constructing dimensions with the attack methods of other planes. Although it seemed that his methods had improved by countless times compared to before, as if they had undergone a tremendous transformation, it was as if he had undergone an earth-shattering transformation. But in fact, he had only completed the most basic combination of the two. In other words, the attack power that he displayed now was actually only the most basic attack power after the combination of the two. This method of combination still had great potential that could be unearthed. If he could further unearth its potential, the power that this method could unleash would definitely be countless times greater than what he could unleash now. As for how to unearth the potential, the direction had actually been pointed out a long time ago. The number and types of planes could be said to be infinite. Among them, the concept plane, the existence plane, the cause and effect plane, the space-time plane, the power plane, the destiny plane, the illusion plane, and so on were actually insignificant compared to the planes as a whole. It was just like how an ant was equivalent to a small part of the universe. Under such circumstances, the combination of dimensions and planes was like working on an ant in a universe. Therefore, in order to truly unearth the potential of this method, one had to look beyond these more common planes and expand one's vision to countless planes. The more thorough this expansion was, the more terrifying the power of this method would be. Previously, the will of the heavens and earth had only used the plane of reality to copy and assimilate the other planes, and had not completely suppressed and controlled all the planes. It could be seen that the will of the heavens and earth's understanding and control the other planes was far from being able to fully understand and control all the planes. In this way, if this method continued to expand in this direction, there would come a day when this expansion would touch a point that the will of heaven and earth could not reach. Once he reached that point, The resistance of the will of the world would naturally be non-existent to him. At that time, at the very least, the events that had occurred in that space-time would occur once again. In the distance, rays of spiritual light flickered. There was an aura that Luo Fan found inexplicably familiar within that spiritual light. Those were the auras of the world founders he had saved before. Evidently, those world founders had completely left the region that he controlled and had broken free from the shackles of the will of the heavens and earth. Luo Fan did not have any intention to investigate the current objective of those world founders. At this moment, he swept his gaze across those world founders, but he did not leave much impression on them. Although this part of the world was still vast and incomparably huge, the area that he tore off seemed so insignificant compared to the area that was still intact in this part of the world. However, in the end, he had already torn a piece of this world apart. This meant that he had finally achieved some results in his battle against this region, or rather, in his battle against the will of the heavens and earth. Although the effects were not great, it was equivalent to stabbing a needle into someone's body. A needle seemed insignificant, but to any living being, having a needle pierced into their body would have a significant impact. If he used it well, the needle could even become a rope that would take one's life. For example, perhaps he could inject a certain poison into someone's body through the needle. Found it. Very soon, Luo Fan narrowed his eyes and locked onto a certain change that should not have appeared in this region of the world. From the thread of the needle, it was clear that this region of the world, or rather, the will of the heavens and earth, would definitely not allow the needle to exist. It would definitely think of all sorts of methods to deal with the needle, or rather, the region that Luo Fan was in that had broken free from the shackles of the will of the heavens and earth. At this moment, the region that appeared before Luo Fan was clearly in existence that the will of the heavens and earth had specially created to deal with this region. In that region, some sort of indescribable power was continuously gathering towards the surface of the sea. Vaguely, some sort of space-time seemed to be gradually being born from this gathering process. At the same time, under the surface of the sea, in the boundless seawater, there were countless indescribable mysterious existences that were gradually gathering towards this region from all directions, responding to the space-time that was constantly gathering and being born. After discovering this space-time, he quickly grasped the basic characteristics of this space-time. Immediately after, he probed in all directions according to these characteristics, and soon discovered that there were hundreds of billions of similar existences in all directions. These existences seemed insignificant compared to the region that had broken free from the shackles of the will of the heavens and earth. However, the way they were distributed, they almost completely enveloped all directions of this region. Once these existences truly grew stronger, they would definitely become a new kind of shackles that would seal off this region from all directions. Let me see what's inside. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan's clone appeared out of thin air in front of him and headed towards the region where the strange space-time was condensing out of thin air. This clone was naturally born from the surge of the power related to the true saint. It was an incarnation that was condensed from a power that was extremely similar to that power, but its essence was much different. This incarnation was also the one that he had used to save the many world founders. Compared to the incarnation at the boundary, this incarnation's essence was quite different, although it was actually similar. The incarnation at the boundary was an incarnation that was directly condensed from the power related to the true divine. This incarnation also held the three-legged cauldron that could release a suppressive force that could suppress everything. In fact, it was precisely because this incarnation held such a three-legged cauldron that Luo Fan did not let this incarnation leave this region to explore the outside world. After all, this three-legged cauldron was the most powerful offensive and defensive means that he could rely on at the moment. If this three-legged cauldron left this region, it would be equivalent to having no cover for him. Evidently, this situation was extremely irrational in the face of the extremely powerful will of the world. Therefore, he directly let another incarnation head towards the region that was condensing and being born. Anyway, that incarnation could also summon the suppressive force through the connection between the incarnations, and it was actually enough to deal with all the changes. That incarnation was also Luo Fan, so its speed was naturally needless to say. Even if the distance between that region and this region was calculated in light years, it only took Luo Fan a few breaths to directly cross the distance between the two regions. Being used to the region where he had broken free from the shackles, Luo Fan felt rather oppressive towards the region that was full of shackles outside. At this moment, this kind of oppressive feeling had reached its peak where he was standing. This was because the shackles here were hundreds or thousands of times stronger than those in other regions. In this region, all laws, energy, matter, and even the mysteries of the Great Tao were completely controlled. At this moment, everything was slowly wriggling in this region in an indescribable manner, slowly changing. There was only one manipulator of all of this, and that was the will of the world. Indeed, it's creating something against me. Faced with this extraordinary oppressive feeling, Luo Fan could only shake his head and sigh. This extraordinary oppressive feeling clearly meant that the control of the will of the world over this region was hundreds or thousands of times stronger than that of other regions. Obviously, something that required hundreds or thousands of times more control in order to create naturally would not be simple. The space-time was constructed out of thin air, and at this moment, it seemed to be slowly squeezed out of nothingness. However, in fact, this was just an illusion. The squeezing state was actually just an illusion caused by the way this space-time was appearing. In fact, that space-time didn't exist at all before this. The endless power in the surroundings was constantly squeezing and accumulating. And in that space-time, everything was walking out of the illusion with a slight thought. Luo Fan lifted his hand and floated towards the space-time in front of him. A powerful force was released from his hand, directly shattering the surrounding space-time. In the blink of an eye, the surrounding space-time turned from its originally calm and gentle appearance into endless fragments, which began to drift in all directions along with the wind from his palm. From the outside, it looked like he had only slapped out with his palm, and then everything in front of him completely collapsed. A gust of wind erupted from his palm, directly wiping out the space-time within tens of millions of miles in front of him. This method should have been extremely effective against the space-time, and it should have been enough to produce an astonishing effect on the slowly descending space-time. However, it was a pity that after this palm, the space-time didn't seem any different from before. Clearly, it was still the same as before. Previously, it had slowly descended from nothingness, as if it had been forcefully squeezed out from somewhere. Now it was still the same. Even the seawater below, the endless power, and the endless power in the surroundings. Everything was the same as before. It was as if his palm strike just now was just an illusion, and it did not affect anything that existed in reality at all. When Luo Fan saw this, he frowned slightly. After he stopped moving, the surrounding space-time began to recover rapidly. In the blink of an eye, everything seemed to have returned to its original appearance, as if nothing had happened. I can only go in and take a look. With a slight thought, Luo Fan's figure turned into a shadow, and he dashed towards the emerging space-time. As long as space-time existed, there would naturally be traces. Even if the way it existed was extremely strange, since it had been discovered by Luo Fan, it was naturally no longer an obstacle for Luo Fan. Therefore, at this moment, even if he couldn't destroy the space-time, and the slap just now couldn't really touch this space-time, it was still a simple matter for him to enter that space-time. Soon, he directly passed through the layers of obstacles and directly entered that space-time in an indescribable way. After arriving here, he felt an indescribable malice surging towards him. This malice was so strong that it felt like the purest malice in the universe. And it was also the most malice directed at him. Even to him, the amount of this malice wasn't enough to pose any threat to him. If he wanted to, he could completely destroy this malice with just a slight movement. He couldn't help but frown slightly at the existence of this malice. This strong malice is indeed directed at me. Withstanding this malice, Luo Fan began to carefully observe this space-time. This space-time was still in the process of being constructed, and it was currently extremely broken. At the very least, it was in an extremely imperfect state. When he looked over, even time had not completely stabilized. Various timelines were mixed together in an extremely strange way, displaying all kinds of strange and mysterious things that could not appear in normal space-time. Chapter 2908. Everything in this space-time seemed to be in a semi-finished state at this moment. Everything seemed to have a complete template, but everything had yet to be constructed according to that template. Instead, it was as if various things were taken out from the template and placed in the designated positions. It looked extremely messy, but vaguely, it seemed to strictly follow a certain law. At this moment, although Luo Fan had already entered this space-time, there was still an indescribable barrier between him and this space-time. Although he could see everything in this space-time, it was almost impossible for him to get involved. Just like at this moment, where he was standing, the space-time completely ignored him. It kept gathering and stabilizing according to the state when he did not exist. Just like at this moment, where he stood, the space and time completely ignored him, gathering and stabilizing according to the state when he didn't exist. Aside from space-time, the laws, energy, matter, and so on, practically everything treated him as if he didn't exist. Luo Fan's heart stirred slightly. He lifted his foot and took a light step forward. His figure had already arrived at the core of this space-time. Luo Fan's heart was slightly moved. He lifted his foot and took a light step forward. His figure had already arrived at the core of this space-time. It was just that different space-times, worlds, and heaven and earth would have different attitudes toward the core. Some space-times, worlds, and heaven and earth regarded the core as the most important point. They placed the most important things and the most important existences in the core. Some space-time, worlds, or heaven and earth regarded the core as the most important point, placing the most important things and existences in the core. Some space-times, worlds, and heaven and earth regarded the core as the most important point. They placed the most important things and the most important existences in the core. And some directly regarded it as the most ordinary position and did not place anything special in it. This space-time belonged to the first category. In other words, it was a space-time that placed the most important things at its core. At this moment, Luo Fan directly arrived in front of the core. At a glance, he saw a strange race that was brewing and growing. That's right, it was not an expert, nor was it a magic treasure, but a race. The number of this race was quite shocking. Just the number that had been born now needed to be counted in the hundreds of billions. At this moment, the creatures of this race were densely packed in the core, looking like dead things. However, Luo Fan was able to clearly sense the terrifying energy contained within those living beings' bodies, as well as the miraculous characteristic of them resonating with the world outside. Looking at these living beings, Luo Fan had an epiphany. If this great world had a natural Tao body, its appearance might be similar to the creatures in front of him at this moment. This kind of living being that resonated with the heaven and earth in the outside world and seemed to be able to mobilize the infinite power contained in the outside world with a single breath could only be possessed by those with innate Taoism aptitudes that were extremely compatible with the heaven and earth. Furthermore, it was not an ordinary innate Taoism aptitude that had not mastered any power. Instead, it was a characteristic that could only be obtained after one had stimulated the characteristics of the innate Taoism aptitude to the extreme and used it to its peak. Luo Fan looked at the tribe in front of him with an inexplicable expression. This space-time was just one of the billions of space-times that were currently brewing. The tribe here was obviously just one of the billions of space-times. At this time, he could only regard the other space-times as similar to the one in front of him. Therefore, it was meaningless to deal with this space-time and this tribe alone. The most important thing should be to figure out the characteristics of these tribes and the characteristics of these space-times, and finally sum up a way to deal with them easily. Only by summing up the methods could he use a short enough time to get rid of all these spacetimes before they were fully brewed and eliminate the unforeseen extent of the worlds while targeting him. With this conclusion in mind, Luo Fan naturally did not hesitate anymore. His heart stirred slightly, and his perception began to cover the core of this space-time in front of him. He began to go deeper and deeper into the core, and even deeper into the tribe, to figure out their nature. First of all, he naturally had to figure out why the worlds will want to give birth to them, and what kind of threat could these tribes pose to him. Second, he had to find out their weakness, and find out how he could cleanly and completely get rid of this tribe along with his space-time. His perception continued to penetrate deeper, and an endless amount of information began to flow towards him through his perception. After all, these creatures were only in the process of being born. Since they were in the process of being born, there would definitely be various stages. Some were born at 10%, some were born at 30%, some were born at 70%, and some were born at 90%. In this way, as long as one was willing, one would naturally be able to clearly understand the entire process of the birth of these tribes. Knowing all this was equivalent to knowing a lot more. Regarding the power of this tribe, the nature of this tribe, and so on and so forth, one could naturally be considered to have grasped the clues. At this time, Luo Fan began to use this method to dig deeper into the secrets and nature of this tribe's creatures. As his understanding of the creatures in this tribe deepened, he gradually found a way around the secrets of this tribe that were originally protected by this space-time, or rather, the secrets that were protected by the world's will. I see. At a certain moment, an inexplicable smile appeared on his face. Then, his perception suddenly rose to an indescribable height and faintly matched with some extremely fundamental wave frequency in the real world. In an instant, the space-time and the tribe that seemed to be separated by a layer in front of him instantly became extremely clear. A subtle breeze swept past this space-time along with his perception. In just the blink of an eye, the originally smooth process of this space-time started to give birth to many twists and turns. Many things that should have been able to be born properly lost their original positions after the breeze passed by, causing the things that were finally born to become crooked. It was so much so that even the laws and laws were in an indescribable state of chaos when a breeze swept past them. The laws and laws had an extremely deep impact on space-time, the world, and the world. Just a little chaos was enough to cause space-time, the world, and the world to change drastically. At this moment, under the disturbance of the laws and laws by the breeze, the entire space-time started to let out creaking sounds, as if it could no longer bear the burden and was about to completely collapse in the next moment. The originally seemingly scattered but orderly process of birth became completely chaotic at this moment. At a glance, there's almost nothing in the entire space-time that could be dealt with. Whether it was space-time or energy, the laws and laws, living beings, or inanimate objects, everything became increasingly distorted at this moment. Boom, boom. Suddenly, a thunderous sound came from the void. Immediately after, an indescribable pressure suddenly enveloped this space-time. In this pressure, Luo Fan could sense a familiar feeling that belonged to the world's will. He tried to probe with his perception and found that a huge vortex had enveloped this space-time. Within it, waves of indescribable power were constantly being born and injected into this space-time, constantly calming down the chaos that was originally disturbed by the breeze of perception. That was obviously the great world's will, and it was also suspected to be the incarnation of the will of the calamity level, or even the incarnation of the will that simulated the state of chaos. At the same time, Luo Fan felt a feeling of being locked on from the bottom of his heart. I still haven't learned my lesson. At this moment, Luo Fan sighed. With such a sigh, he raised his hand and pointed forward. In just an instant, the billions of living beings that were sleeping in the space-time core in front of him completely collapsed. In just the blink of an eye, they had turned from a densely packed state into nothingness. Nothingness. Not even the slightest bit of smoke or powder could be found. If someone had known about the existence of the many living beings in this race, they would have discovered that their memories of this race were gradually becoming blurred. Obviously, the race's physical body was not the only thing that had been erased. Even the concept of the race and the essence of the existence of the race itself had been completely erased. As the changes in the space-time core appeared, the entire space-time shook violently at this moment. The integrity of the space-time that was originally maintained by the worlds will completely disappear at this moment. The entire space-time was filled with cracks, fragments, and chaos everywhere. Everything that was gradually born from nothingness was destroyed at this moment, returning to nothingness. Seeing this scene, the worlds will finally give up on continuing to maintain this space-time. However, even if he gave up on this space-time, he would not let Luo Fan go. If he were to shrink it even further, he could directly destroy this space-time with his own body. In the blink of an eye, it had already shrunk to Luo Fan's surroundings. In other words, it had turned into a state that only wrapped around Luo Fan. The vortex itself was the incarnation of the world's will, and it itself represented this great world. Its power also represented the power of the world, based on the size of the world. Even if it was just an incarnation of the world's will, it was tens of millions of times stronger than any world founder. At this moment, although Luo Fan's incarnation was much stronger than ordinary world founders, it was still in the category of world founders. In the face of the vortex that was enveloping him, he seemed extremely insignificant in terms of pure strength. At this moment, the pressure that originally acted on the entire space-time had condensed around Luo Fan's body, and its strength had skyrocketed tens of thousands of times. The sound that originally came from the space-time itself had now become the sound that came from Luo Fan's body. This sound was caused by the space-time within his body, the structure of his body, and even his will. Under this pressure, it was showing signs of gradually collapsing. In the face of this situation, the original Luo Fan could only rely on the three-legged cauldron that was condensed from the power related to a true sage to release the pressure to resist. However, at this moment, he clearly had more choices. With a slight thought, his perception quickly gathered in front of him, and in the blink of an eye, it had already turned into a mirror. After this mirror appeared, it emitted countless rays of light. The rays of light pierced through everything around it, and the terrifying pressure actually completely melted like snow meeting the sun. As the pressure melted, Luo Fan felt relaxed all over his body. The rattling sounds that came from within his body disappeared without a trace, as if they had never appeared in the first place. At this moment, the will of heaven and earth shook slightly, and indescribable rays of light shot towards him from all directions like countless sharp arrows. Faced with these rays of light, the rays of light released by the perception mirror could not gain the slightest upper hand. Under that kind of light, he kept collapsing and exploding, filling his surroundings with endless shock waves. The endless shock waves gathered in one place, causing the surroundings to seem to have turned into a chaotic state of chaos. If this was in the past, I would be at my wit's end. But now, Luo Fan sneered at this moment. His perception mirror was a change that was derived from his perception matching with a certain extremely fundamental wave frequency in the reality plane. Although it was just a mirror condensed from perception, in fact, it had already contained his own body's characteristics in the reality plane. It could be said that this was already one of the pinnacle achievements of his previous use of the plane. In the beginning, such an achievement would definitely have an extremely strong effect on the will of heaven and earth before he launched that move against the residents of the will of heaven and earth. However, ever since he launched that move, which allowed the area around his world of laws to completely break free from the shackles of the will of heaven and earth, it obviously no longer had a strong effect on the will of heaven and earth. After all, this perception mirror seemed to be completely different from that move, but the essence of the two was not much different. They were both purely relying on some basic characteristics of the plane to act. Chapter 2909. Of course, this was all in the past. The current Luo Fan was already different from before. It could be said that his mystic arts were improving at every moment. With every passing moment, his understanding of cultivation and his understanding of the combination of dimensions and planes was constantly deepening. Although this strengthening still couldn't allow him to break through the resonance of the world's will and cause damage to the world's will again. At the very least, he had enough confidence. At the very least, he had enough confidence in facing the incarnation of the world's will before him. At this moment, his heart moved slightly, and the phantoms of mirrors appeared out of thin air and surrounded the perceptual mirror. As they rotated around the perceptual mirror, they constantly shrank and approached the perceptual mirror. In the end, they directly collided with the perceptual mirror and completely fused with it. There were hundreds of these mirror phantoms. After they fused with the perceptual mirror, the aura that the mirror itself emitted became increasingly ethereal and mysterious. Immediately afterward, the perceptual mirror once again released an indescribable brilliance that spread out in all directions. The brilliance directly penetrated the brilliance released by the surrounding vortex and directly entered the vortex. Although it was all brilliance, the brilliance released by the vortex instantly dimmed when it was penetrated by the mirror's brilliance. Soon after, it completely collapsed and turned into endless light spots that disappeared without a trace. It seemed that some indescribable existence that belonged to the light released by the vortex had been erased at this moment. At this moment, the vortex began to tremble violently. All sorts of indescribable lights and shadows appeared in the center of the vortex. As these lights and shadows appeared, the vortex seemed to begin some kind of indescribable transition, and its essence seemed to be undergoing an indescribable transformation. Under this transformation, the light and shadows released by the mirror were weakened layer by layer. It seemed that many rays of light were constantly being turned into nothingness and continuously weakened, causing the light to actually become dimmer and dimmer. However, in the end, the transformation of the vortex was still not enough. Although the brilliance continued to weaken, in the end, there was still light that penetrated the vortex and directly illuminated the void around the vortex. Under this change, the vortex trembled and gradually collapsed. Not long after, it turned completely invisible, like ordinary smoke, and disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared in the first place. At this moment, under the brilliance released by Luo Fan's perception mirror, the chaos in the surroundings was gradually smoothed out. By the time everything was wiped out, the surrounding space-time had completely disappeared. This place was like an extremely ordinary sea surface in this world. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan just shook his head slightly and sighed. The fusion is not perfect enough. Although the perceptive mirror had already destroyed the incarnation of the will of the heavens and earth, it had also completely destroyed this space-time. However, he was not very satisfied with the process. If his method was perfect, the light wouldn't be weakened at all when it shone on the vortex. Instead, it would rush out from the other direction and easily erase the vortex. However, the final result was that the brilliance released by his perceptive mirror was weakened layer by layer, and in the end, it barely managed to get rid of the vortex. This situation showed that his perceptive mirror's fusion between dimensions and planes had not reached a perfect level. Because it was not perfect enough, it could not support each other, transform each other, and make up for each other. That was why there were flaws, and it was weakened layer by layer. Of course, this obviously also meant that his understanding of dimensions and planes was far from enough. This time, he did not achieve a perfect attack to attack the vortex, which meant that this attack would no longer be effective against the will of the heavens and earth the next time. The will of the heavens and earth was ultimately the will of the heavens and earth. The reason why he had easily dealt with it before was because he was not familiar with this attack. To be honest, this kind of attack wasn't too high in terms of level. As long as the will of the heavens and earth was familiar with one of the attacks, unless the attack was flawless, perfect, and flawless, the attack would definitely be full of flaws in the hands of the will of the heavens and earth and would no longer be effective. It was just like the method he used to completely liberate the region that spanned billions of light years. After that, wasn't it no longer effective against the will of the heavens and earth? In fact, it was not only that method that was ineffective, but similar methods could no longer be effective against the space-time. From a certain point of view, the fact that Luo Fan could still use this mirror to get rid of the incarnation of the will of the heavens and earth showed that he had made rapid progress in the fusion of dimensions and planes. With a slight thought, he turned to look at the other space-times that were brewing. Instantly, he smiled bitterly. There was an indescribable aura in those space-times. An aura that was completely targeted at him, or rather, an aura that was completely targeted at his perceptive mirror. Obviously, after the incarnation of the will of the heavens and earth was destroyed, the will of the heavens and earth instantly patched up those space-times, giving them the ability to resist the perceptive mirror. This situation made Luo Fan feel rather helpless. If he wanted to, he could indeed break through a few more space-times and destroy them. There is no doubt that with Luo Fan's ability, he would definitely be able to come up with a few new methods to deal with the space-times in a short period of time. But what was the point of that? After all, the number of space-times was calculated in trillions or even trillions. Not to mention a few space-times, even if tens of millions, hundreds of millions, or even billions of space-times were destroyed. So what? Compared to the overall number of space-times, it was still insignificant. On the contrary, coming up with some new methods gave the will of the heavens and earth a chance to familiarize itself with his methods. It even gave the will of the heavens and earth a chance to analyze his thoughts. Compared to destroying the insignificant space-time, his information, his train of thought, and his inspiration were obviously more important. Therefore, at this time, Luo Fan no longer intended to take the risk and continue. Then let me see what methods you have. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind as he turned around and headed towards the wider world behind the space-time. He naturally would not continue to stay in these space-times, let alone at the border of the area. There was an incarnation that controlled the three-legged cauldron and could release endless suppressive power to defend everything there. In contrast, the most important task of his incarnation with the perceptive mirror was obviously to see this world, observe it, and study it, just as this incarnation headed towards the wider world. The incarnation that controlled the three-legged cauldron did not stay still. At this moment, this incarnation sent out wave after wave of power, which began to open up the corresponding space-times in the area outside. Although he wanted to see what the purpose of creating these space-times was and what the will of the heavens and earth intended to achieve with the races in those space-times. However, this did not prevent him from creating some obstacles. Creating corresponding space-times was obviously a matter of course for him. Of course, he did not completely replicate the appearance of the space-time outside. Instead, he vaguely arranged these space-times in a subtle way, allowing them to vaguely build a huge formation. It was a formation that could completely envelop the entire border. This formation's magical effect was not obvious, and no one knew what it was used for. However, at this moment, it was like a sharp sword suspended in mid-air, making one feel as if there was a fishbone stuck in one's throat. With Luo Fan's ability, it would naturally be extremely difficult for him to open up a perfect world. However, if he were to open up an ordinary world, it would be as simple as eating and drinking. Moreover, what he was opening up now was only a piece of space-time that was dependent on the outside world. This kind of thing was even easier for him. In just a few dozen breaths, an unknown number of trillions of space-times that corresponded to the outside space-time had already been rapidly formed. Of course, Luo Fan was ultimately not the will of the heavens and earth, and he did not have such a huge body. Therefore, although these space-times have been formed, the things within them, the laws within them, and the races within them were still in the process of brewing. It would obviously take quite a long time for them to truly be completed and truly born. However, this did not affect the outside world much. Although it needed to be attached to the outside world, the space-time itself already contained time and space. With Luo Fan's ability, it was not a problem at all to distort the flow of time in those space-times. Even if the creatures and races in those space-times needed a long time to brew, they would still be able to make it in time in the end. It's much livelier. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan leisurely sighed. Currently, the situation in this world had clearly undergone a tremendous change compared to before. The original emptiness and lifeless atmosphere could no longer be seen. Whether it was this area that had broken free from the shackles of the will of the world, or the areas that were still under the shackles of the will of the world in the outside world, they seemed to be filled with vitality and were extraordinarily lively. Of course, all of this was clearly the situation in this area that was close to the area that had broken free from the shackles of the will of the world. The areas further out were actually still lifeless. At least, that was the case in the eyes of Luo Fan's clone. Along the way, Luo Fan also saw many of the founders that he had saved. However, he had no intention of going up to greet those founders. After all, he had already severed all ties with them. Now that he did not go up to look at them in the mirror, it could already be considered that he still cherished the old times. At the same time that Luo Fan saw them, the heaven and earth pioneers naturally saw him too. However, just like Luo Fan, they did not go up to greet him at all. The friendlier ones only glanced at Luo Fan with complicated gazes. Most of them were expressionless, as if they did not notice Luo Fan at all. They treated him like air. Luo Fan naturally did not care about such a development at all. He only studied this world while heading further away. Although he did not pay much attention to the world founders, he had seen a lot along the way, so he naturally knew what they were doing. Those founders were doing what Luo Fan had previously led them to do, which was to liberate more founders. However, for those liberated world founders, their choice was not the same as Luo Fan's. They did not persuade those world founders to leave with them. Instead, after they were liberated, they left behind some contact information and agreed to help each other. On the other hand, the will of the heavens and the earth completely ignored them and the creators of the world they liberated. It didn't follow Luo Fan like it did back then, and it didn't show any signs of wanting to completely erase everything Luo Fan had done. Due to the efforts of those founders, this world was clearly becoming more and more lively and full of life. Luo Fan took a quick look and no longer paid attention to the world's founders. Although he was not in a hurry, he did not waste too much time either. He kept heading out, and gradually, the surroundings became more and more empty and lifeless. Initially, they were still able to see some world founders, but unknowingly, the number of world founders was decreasing. In the end, he could no longer see them. The reason for this was that Luo Fan's range of activity had already surpassed the range of all the founders that he had seen before. Of course, although the founders could no longer be seen, the surroundings were not completely lifeless. In fact, although the creator of the world no longer existed, the various derivatives that the world had absorbed from the simulated primal chaos still spread out in an almost random manner. Even Luo Fan could not imagine how many worlds there were in the simulated primal chaos. Chapter 29:10. Even in a place that was extremely far away from Luo Fan's world of laws, there were still countless derivatives existing. These derivatives seemed to have been born at the same time as the world and were randomly distributed all over this world. At least based on what Luo Fan had seen and heard about this world, there was no place where the derivatives were more concentrated than other places. At the same time, there was not a single location where the derivatives were more sparse than the rest of the locations. Although the distribution of the derivatives was not completely uniform, it was more or less uniform. Because of this, even though it had far exceeded the range of activity of the creator of the world, the surrounding situation was still similar to the surroundings of the world of laws. It was still not monotonous. This side of the world was simply too big. Even if Luo Fan could use various subtle methods to find the direction of the core, it was not an easy task to actually get there. Even if space-time was not an obstacle to him, it was still the same. This process of continuous advancement continued for several years. When he reached the boundary of the area that had broken free from the shackles of the will of heaven and earth, the space-time derived from the will of heaven and earth had truly taken shape, and the space-time corresponding to it had also been perfected. Only then did he truly sense the location of the core of the world. The core of the world was an extremely mysterious concept. In reality, it was a concept that existed within space-time, but it was also a concept that exceeded space-time. If one were to insist that it was inside space-time and belonged to a certain key node in this world, it would make sense. However, if one really treated it as that node, it would be a huge mistake. It was like a metaphysical existence. If one wanted to find it, one could only find the corresponding location. However, one cannot truly find it just by finding the corresponding location. At this moment, what Luo Fan came into contact with was that node. This node was faintly discernible, illusory, yet real at the same time. It seemed to be a very ordinary location in this world. It also seemed to be the most important place in this world. There seemed to be nothing special about it, but it also seemed to be closely related to everything in this world. This was the core of the world. Or rather, it was the place where the core and the normal space-time of this world intersected. It was the place of reflection. Why didn't that power choose this place? Why did it choose the perfect world? Looking at this core, the doubts that had accumulated in Luo Fan's heart for a long time surfaced once again. No matter how much he opposed the will of the world, he had to admit that this world was extremely great. Compared to this world, even a perfect world was nothing. It could only be considered insignificant. Under such circumstances, if the power related to the true divine wanted to use the core of a world as its residence, it would obviously choose the world core in front of them, as compared to a perfect world core. However, it was obvious that this was all in Luo Fan's imagination. The power related to the true divine simply didn't care about this world. It didn't care about the core at all. Between the perfect world and this world that was many times greater than the perfect world, it actually chose the perfect world. No matter how one looked at it, it was an incomprehensible matter. The reason this had happened was obviously because there was something at the core of this world that Luo Fan was unaware of. Perhaps it was a loophole, perhaps it was a weakness, or perhaps it was simply not comfortable enough. However, the answer to all this would perhaps be revealed very soon. After all, the core of the world was already in front of him. It was just waiting for him to step into it. Even though the derivatives absorbed from the world were evenly distributed throughout this world, it was impossible for them to survive. However, almost was only almost. It was impossible to be truly evenly distributed. At least, the number of derivatives around this node, which was the core of the world, was several times more than the other areas with the highest concentration of derivatives. As long as one observed carefully, they would realize that this place was definitely not ordinary. Moreover, the characteristics of the many derivatives were rather unique. They seemed to be resonating with each other and faintly gathered into a strange whole. It was not a formation, not a talisman, not a divine ability, not a magic art, and definitely not some inexplicable talisman or something like that. That was simply a whole that resonated with each other. This whole was faintly discernible, and its characteristics were quite similar to the core of the world. Since he was already here, Luo Fan naturally could not retreat so easily. At this moment, with just a thought, the perception mirror had already appeared in front of him. With a slight shake, countless specks of light were released from the mirror and continuously condensed in the void. In the blink of an eye, it had already turned into a path of light. Starting from a mirror, it extended all the way to the center of the derivatives, the node that corresponded to the core of the world. The moment this path of light was formed, the many derivatives trembled slightly. Suddenly, an inexplicable power was born out of thin air and began to corrode the path of light. In the blink of an eye, the path of light had already become modeled. Not long after, it had already broken into countless pieces. All the originally condensed light instantly collapsed and turned into endless specks of light. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared without a trace. Faced with such a situation, an inexplicable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. Looks like there are indeed many arrangements. At this moment, he vaguely understood why the power related to the true divine did not care about this core. It was like a disposable bag. After it had already been filled with trash, who would pour out the trash and put it on their heads, to the power related to the true divine. Everything in the simulated chaotic state, even if it was created by the existence that simulated the chaotic state's will, was almost a type of trash. Under such circumstances, the core that was occupied by the arrangements of the worlds was obviously equivalent to a bag that had already been filled with trash. Even to the power related to the true divine, it was an extremely simple task to empty the bag and then clean it. However, it was very obvious that even if everything returned to its original state, the disgust in its heart would definitely not disappear. Although the power related to the true divine was not a real living being, this disgust should still exist. Of course, this was only a guess formed from the little bit of information that had been gathered in front of him. As for the specifics, whether it was what he thought it was would depend on whether the arrangements in the core really existed. The whole body, formed by the many derivatives, was like a living creature. Although it did not have a body and did not have a consciousness, it had some sort of instinctive reaction ability. It had an unimaginable repelling effect on any power or matter that invaded it. With a slight thought, Luo Fan raised his hand and grabbed the perceptive mirror in front of him. Countless shadows flashed past, and the mirrors seemed to have become even more simple and unadorned in an instant. However, corresponding to this change, the aura that the mirror itself emitted became even more powerful. In fact, it had even caused an indescribable distortion in the surrounding space-time, and one could even faintly see traces of cracks appearing in the distortion. This was only caused by the existence of the mirror itself. From this, one could imagine how unimaginable the power of the mirror would be if it was truly activated. After the mirror developed such a change, Luo Fan did not hesitate. With a slight thought, a monster suddenly rushed out of the mirror. This monster looked like a human, but its body was extremely strange. Its arms were extremely long, and if it were to really relax, it would probably drag dozens of meters in front and behind it. On the other hand, its body was thin and long. Its legs were extremely thick, but they were relatively short. At least, compared to its arms, they were extremely short. As for its facial features, they were extremely strange. Its cheeks were densely packed with eyes, and when they blinked slightly, it would make one dizzy. On the other hand, its mouth was extremely small, as if it was just a small hole. One could not even see if there were teeth inside. Its ears were like tentacles, constantly swaying in the wind on both sides of its head. The entire appearance clearly did not conform to the standards of the average person. After this monster left the mirror, its figure kept changing. It suddenly disappeared, then reappeared, and then completely lost its presence. Then, it would suddenly have an unimaginable presence. Sometimes it was like the gathering of rules and karma, and sometimes it was like an illusory and formless thing. At this moment, it violently crashed into the body formed by the many derivatives in front of it. The whole body was instantly activated, and an unknown amount of indescribable power continuously gathered in one spot, wanting to annihilate the monster. However, this monster kept changing in the process. In a short while, it had already transformed into the state where the power that was gathering in the surroundings had directly merged with the power and easily made its way to the center, where the node corresponding to the core of the world was located. The whole made up of countless derivatives seemed to have been enraged at this moment. It released all sorts of indescribable power in a frenzy. Through the circulation within the whole made up of derivatives, it turned into a terrifying power that was getting stronger and stronger. It quickly crushed towards the monster. At this moment, time and space, rules and laws, matter, energy, karma, fate, and everything else was completely separated. With this core as the center, it formed an independent space and time, or rather an independent world, an independent heaven and earth. Although this core area was only a node, in reality, the area it occupied was rather large. In fact, one would need to calculate it in light years to clearly describe its area. In the eyes of an ordinary cultivator, such a vast area was already unimaginably vast. Not to mention a single world. Even thousands of worlds would be easily separated. An indescribable malice rose into the sky. Even though it seemed to be separated from the whole body by dimension and space, Luo Fan could still clearly feel this unimaginably terrifying malice. Under this malice, everything in the world seemed to be stained with some kind of dusky color, as if all the beauty had been completely devoured. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. Is that all? Looks like this isn't an arrangement that could be updated at any time, he thought to himself. In the past, this method might have been a little troublesome if he had not comprehended the method of combining dimensions and planes. However, now that he had comprehended this method of combining dimensions and planes, and had even developed this method to a rather profound level over the years, this kind of arrangement was just a joke. At this moment, he did not even need to do anything. With just a slight thought, the monster reflected by the perceptual mirror suddenly opened its mouth, causing the originally small mouth to suddenly expand to a size that was almost larger than its entire body. Then, an unimaginable suction force appeared above the mouth, and the endless malice outside was like 100 rivers flowing into the sea, crazily pouring into the huge mouth, disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. When all the malice that was enough to erase all the beauty in the surroundings disappeared, the power released by the whole body of derivatives was like a fortress on the beach, collapsing into nothingness in the blink of an eye. At this moment, the monster had already returned to its original appearance. It looked as if nothing had happened, and it was still standing there quietly like before. Without malice, its power naturally don't know where to vent, Luo Fan thought to himself. Without any hesitation, he lifted his foot and walked toward the core. Every single derivative was formed by a part of the world, and the power, and essence contained within each derivative was not something that ordinary objects and powers could compare to. If they really erupted unscrupulously, destroying heaven and earth would be a piece of cake. When they were combined, the effect produced was even more earth-shattering. If all the power of this whole body was used on a creator of the world, even if the creator of the world was thousands of times more powerful than the creator of the world, there was no reason for him to survive. Chapter 29:11. It was like a man whose organs were crippled. Although he longed for something in his heart, he could not awaken that organ no matter how hard he tried. At this time, the whole body formed by these derivatives was like that. The malice that was being swallowed was not just the malice that was shown on the surface. Even the mechanism that produced the malice and the source of the malice had been swallowed by the monster. Therefore, after being swallowed by the monster, the whole body had completely lost the ability to produce malice and had completely lost the ability to attack. Even if the whole body instinctively knew that it could gather endless power to completely obliterate Luo Fan, it was unable to do so. No matter how hard it tried, it was unable to condense the endless power that originally existed in its body onto its target. At this time, although there was endless power slightly surging in the surroundings, and infinite power was gathering with all its might, Luo Fan was like a breeze, easily crossing a long distance. In a short while, he had already arrived next to the monster from the perception mirror. He stood directly at the connection between the core of the world and the surface space-time. The moment he stood there, he suddenly felt like he had become the center of the entire world. It was as if the entire world was revolving around him, and everything in the world was revolving around him. This feeling made him even more certain that the point in front of him was the core of the world. Only as the core of the world, a position alone could bring him such an indescribable feeling. Of course, Luo Fan would not indulge in this inexplicable feeling. Very soon, he suppressed that feeling and directly controlled the monster that was extremely quiet beside him to charge upward. It directly broke into an extremely vast space-time. This space-time was so huge that it almost exceeded all of Luo Fan's imagination. At a glance, it was probably not much smaller than the residents of the world's will. At this time, there were many strange figures moving in an indescribable way in this space-time. These figures all had different appearances from Luo fans' aesthetic standards. However, every single figure was able to emit a perfect charm, causing one to feel that even such a strange figure possessed an unimaginable charm. This situation could only happen in the image of a certain world's born Taoism aptitude. At this moment, in this world, in the core space-time of this world, countless figures appeared. Clearly, there was no need to guess what they were. These were definitely the countless founders of the world. Perhaps this was not their actual bodies, but their appearance was definitely their appearance. At this time, the monster that Luo Fan had sent out with the help of the perception mirror was instantly subjected to endless, terrifying pressure after entering the space-time. In just an instant, it only had time to transmit what Luo Fan had sensed before it completely collapsed under the terrifying, crushing power and disappeared without a trace. That kind of pressure was so terrifying that even if that monster was a strange state formed by Luo Fan's strange combination of many layers and dimensions, which was enough to destroy all kinds of invisible and intangible sources of anything, it still couldn't resist this kind of terrifying pressure that had suddenly appeared. During the entire process of being suppressed, it did not show any ability to resist at all. At this time, faced with such a situation, Luo Fan slightly frowned. This change was somewhat similar to what he had previously guessed, but also somewhat different. There seemed to be arrangements inside, and there were all kinds of arrangements that were completely rubbish to the power related to the true divine. However, the mysteriousness of this arrangement was still beyond his imagination. This sudden, mysterious pressure was like the fundamental rejection of space-time, and also like the fundamental rejection of the entire world. And what was the purpose of gathering so many figures related to the world's founders? What exactly do you want to do? At this time, Luo Fan could not help but mutter. All of this was obviously created by the world's will. And obviously, the world's will could not have created all of this without a purpose. It must have its own thoughts and goals for doing this. This kind of thoughts and goals was definitely extremely obscure, and it must be of great importance. Perhaps in the end, it might even set off an extremely terrifying disaster for Luo Fan. It was not Luo Fan's wishful thinking that this arrangement might be targeted at him. Instead, it was completely deduced from the fundamental purpose of the world's will. After all, the world's will had already completely understood the meaning of its existence. It knew that its existence was completely because the state of chaos was created to test Luo Fan. And previously, it even expressed that even if it wanted to continue to delay, there was no more time, and there was no other way. Since that was the case, all the situation, all the changes, and all the means it had created were obviously targeted at Luo Fan. The core of the world in front of him was naturally the same. At this time, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. The perception mirror in his hand condensed slightly again, and the other figure leaped out. This figure was not in the shape of a monster, but in the shape of a divine dragon. After appearing, the divine dragon twisted its body slightly, and its figure easily passed through the barrier of space-time, directly stepping into the space-time that was the core of the world. After stepping into it, there was naturally an incredible pressure on the divine dragon. In that instant, as the divine dragon twisted slightly, its body was extremely agile as it dispelled the incredible pressure layer by layer. Countless terrifying forces constantly collided around its body, creating a terrifying impact that shook the heavens and the earth. Circle after circle, it spread in all directions like ripples. This terrifying movement affected an extremely large area. At the beginning, it had already affected the surrounding space-time within dozens of light years. And this was just the beginning. As time passed, as the divine dragon continued to twist and dispel the surrounding pressure, the area of influence continued to expand at an unimaginable speed. After a short while, its range of influence had unknowingly expanded to an area of trillions of light years. In this area that was ravaged by the shock waves, there were naturally countless figures that represented the world's founders. At this time, these figures were stirred by the fluctuations, and as if they were activated, their gazes began to gather in the direction of the divine dragon from all directions, like searchlights focused on the divine dragon. Waves of indescribable agility began to gradually appear in these originally muddle-headed, puppet-like figures. With this agility, the entire space-time seemed to be gradually activated. Vaguely, there was a light that gradually appeared in the void above the void. At first, this light only covered the space-time within trillions of light-years, and its brightness was only average. At most, it was the intensity of normal sunlight in an ordinary world. However, as time passed, as more and more figures focused their gazes on the divine dragon, the light also began to continuously gather and compress. Unknowingly, it had already directly gathered in the location of the divine dragon from its original state of covering trillions of light years, and the brightness had directly increased by trillions of times. It could be said that if an ordinary cultivator faced such a light, they would definitely die. Even if there was no temperature, just the light itself had already reached an unimaginable level of lethality after being condensed to this extent. Any tangible or intangible body would probably be completely annihilated by this light. At that time, what would be destroyed by the light would not only be the body of flesh and blood, but also the soul, divine soul, mind, willpower, life origin, and the essence of life. Even a trace of existence would be completely destroyed. However, it was obvious that the divine dragon was not an ordinary cultivator. In fact, it was not even a cultivator. It was only a special phenomenon constructed by Luo Fan's perceptual mirror by combining dimensions with many other dimensions in an indescribably mysterious way. Although it looked like a divine dragon and a living being, in fact, all of this was just the appearance of that phenomenon. It wasn't even a living creature. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for it to be directly destroyed by the light. Even if it appeared here without any resistance, it was very likely that the divine dragon still had a lot of remnants when the light gathered to this extent. Perhaps it was only slightly injured. Moreover, what was the divine dragon doing at this moment? At this moment, the divine dragon was using the strongest dispersal method to dispel the terrifying pressure of this space-time. Due to this method, any power targeted at the divine dragon will be dispelled by the divine dragon, including the light that could cause damage to the divine dragon itself. At this moment, the light gathered on the divine dragon's body, but it seemed as if it had smashed into a strange crystal divine dragon. All sorts of indescribable diffraction occurred. As the light poured in, it was unknown how many billions of rays of light were emitted from its body and transmitted in all directions, directly smashing into the endless, terrifying pressure in the surroundings. Boom, 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 boom. At this moment, the original silence was finally completely broken. Terrifying roars were constantly emitted from the divine dragon's body. Wave after wave of sound waves swept the surroundings like monstrous waves. Even though the light and the pressure targeted at the divine dragon leaked out, the figures related to the world's founders did not care at all. No matter how the power and light swept past, there was no reaction. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the pressure and light did not exist at all. However, the figures were not so calm in the face of the sudden and terrifying sound waves. Many figures were swept away in all directions like fallen leaves swept by the waves. Some figures even completely collapsed in the sound waves and disintegrated into powder, scattering and disappearing into the void along with the sound waves. In the blink of an eye, this area was emptied. Moreover, the empty area continued to expand, becoming wider and wider. At this moment, the void froze and all changes stopped in an instant. It was as if time had completely stopped at this moment, be it the sound waves, the light, or the terrifying pressure targeted at the divine dragon. All of them were completely frozen at this moment. Everything in the entire space-time seemed to have become a fixed scene in a painting. Faced with this situation, the snake dragon wriggled slightly at this moment and had already broken free from the center of being targeted. It began to fly around and dive into the ground to observe everything around it. Everything was focused on Luo Fan, so that Luo Fan could clearly sense everything it was sensing. At this moment, the space-time suddenly began to shake violently. Due to this shaking, cracks began to appear in the originally stagnant space-time. These cracks covered all the areas of the stagnant space-time. They were densely packed, as if the entire area was completely constructed by the endless fragments. Immediately after, everything collapsed completely. All the fragments scattered and turned into endless powder that began to gradually gather and condense into a huge palm. It was a terrifying palm that looked similar to Luo Fan's palm, but was billions of times larger than Luo Fan's palm. After this palm was formed, it directly grabbed the divine dragon, and with a slight tremble, it completely destroyed the divine dragon. As the divine dragon was destroyed, everything in front of Luo Fan's eyes turned black. The various scenes and senses that were transmitted from the divine dragon had completely disappeared without a trace. This kind of attack. At this moment, Luo Fan had a look of shock on his face. This kind of attack was beyond his imagination. Even though his own methods had been destroyed by this attack, he still couldn't figure out the principle behind this attack, let alone how to resist it. Chapter 29:12. Immediately after, an invisible palm emerged from the void and pressed down on him at a seemingly slow speed. The moment the invisible palm appeared, the sense of crisis skyrocketed by thousands of times. It even felt like this sense of crisis alone was enough to make most cultivators lose control of themselves. This was the palm that had wiped out the divine dragon previously. At this moment, Luo Fan came to a realization. As for why this palm had appeared, he instantly understood the reason. This palm was completely based on the connection between the divine dragon and Luo Fan. It directly broke through space and time and found the source of Luo Fan's body from the tail end. At this moment, it was planning to directly attack Luo Fan's body. At this moment, Luo Fan only shook the mirror in his hand slightly, and countless phantoms appeared on the mirror. Each of them soared into the sky and rushed towards the invisible palm. In the blink of an eye, they collided with the palm. These phantoms were naturally some kind of product of the combination of the dimensions and planes that the mirror could control. Different phantoms meant different ways of combining. Normally, even if the opposing force could resist a certain number of phantoms, which was to say the combination of a certain dimension and plane, it could not resist all the phantoms. However, at this moment, when the numerous phantoms fiercely collided with the invisible palm above, it was like a breeze colliding with a wall. Not even a ripple was stirred up, and it had already been forcefully crushed by the invisible palm. It did not even have the ability to slow down the invisible palm. The palm was still the same as before, which seemed slow but was actually fast as it continuously pressed down, continuously shortening the distance between it and Luo Fan. What a guy! Luo Fan could not help but be secretly amazed. However, he clearly cannot give up just like that. With a slight thought, his own combination of dimensions and planes continuously appeared in his mind. All kinds of wisdom and inspiration were continuously born in his heart. During this process, the perception mirror in his hand also produced corresponding changes, and all kinds of inexplicable images continuously appeared in the mirror. As the images on the mirror changed, the surrounding dimensions were continuously divided. The plane of reality, which originally had no dimensions, was already divided into tens of thousands of dimensions in the blink of an eye. With the help of the planes, there was no longer a need to use the power of the light of heaven and earth to divide the dimensions. The planes themselves were existences that corresponded to the plane of reality. Although there were so many planes, in fact, each plane itself was as vast and powerful as the plane of reality. Under such circumstances, the potential that the light of heaven and earth possessed was obviously not something that the light of heaven and earth could compare to. Therefore, as long as the method of using the light of heaven and earth could do something, other planes could also do it. It was the same for the method of dividing the plane of reality into dimensions. Moreover, compared to what the light of heaven and earth could do, it was actually easier to use other planes to divide the plane of reality. After all, the division of dimensions itself was similar to the structure of the planes in a certain way. In other words, there was a natural, indescribable connection between the two. This connection made the communication of power and power between the two naturally extremely smooth. In this way, it was obviously much easier to use the power of other planes to strengthen the ability of dividing the dimensions than to use the power of that plane to do other things. At this moment, the role that Luo Fan took on was equivalent to a catalyst. He was only equivalent to strengthening and expanding the natural connection between the other planes and the dimensions. After that, no matter how the plane strengthened the ability of dividing the dimensions, or how it improved the effects of dividing the dimensions, this was just the result of the power of the various planes being released. Thousands of planes and dimensions were divided. At this moment, Luo Fan seemed to be in thousands of them at the same time. Among them, in each dimension, he was only facing 1/10,000th of the enemy. Under his method of division, everything around him seemed to have become much thinner. Even the whole body formed by the numerous derivatives around him had been divided into thousands of different parts. Some of them even directly exposed their weakest points in front of Luo Fan. As long as he was willing, he could easily destroy those weak points and completely destroy the whole body of the derivatives. This method seemed to be much more violent than before, when he used the multiple structures of dimensions and planes to devour and destroy the whole body of malice. In terms of technique, it seemed to have regressed. However, in reality, compared to before, the effect of this method against the enemy was many times stronger. If this kind of violent method was just a simple combination of one or two planes and dimensions, it naturally could not be used at all. However, when the number of derivatives increased to thousands, the situation was obviously completely different. Once it reached a certain scale, this originally violent and even crude method of attack instantly became like a tidal wave, becoming unstoppable. At this moment, Luo Fan was even confident that if he had comprehended this method previously, the will of heaven and earth would not have been able to find a way to get rid of his method so easily. After all, the will of heaven and earth could not really communicate with the other planes. To him, if he wanted to stop the various methods that Luo Fan used with the help of the other planes, he could only use indirect methods to achieve his goal. Otherwise, why would it take Luo Fan every time he used it to think of a way to defend against this method? Since it was an indirect method, it was naturally impossible for the reaction to be very fast. Even the will of heaven and earth would not be able to withstand thousands of attacks at the same time that would originally require a huge amount of effort to block each of them. Moreover, what Luo Fan used now was just the beginning. That level was limitless. In other words, if he wanted to, these thousands of dimensions could definitely be multiplied by thousands of times, or even billions of times. For Luo Fan, what he needed to do to multiply the number of dimensions was to strengthen and expand the connection between more planes and dimensions. He did not need to expend too much effort and energy. After that, how the planes supported the dimensions, how to help the dimensions vent their power, and so on were all matters between the planes and dimensions. Compared to resisting the existence of this kind of division of dimensions, the energy needed to eliminate these attacks would probably double for every additional type of attack. If this continued, the final victor would obviously be Luo Fan. At this time, the thousands of dimensions directly divided the space and time where Luo Fan was, causing the space and time within an unknown number of light years around him to be divided into thousands of layers. The whole created by the surrounding derivatives was nothing to Luo Fan. After completely destroying its malice, this whole body was no longer a threat to him. At this time, his focus was on the invisible palm that was pressing down on him from above. The sense of danger he sensed from that palm was simply too strong. This sense of danger was so strong that he suspected that if his incarnation was destroyed here, his real body might be implicated and suffer serious damage. Under such circumstances, of course, he could not shift his focus from the palm in front of him to other existences. In the face of this division of dimensions, circles of ripples flashed continuously on the invisible palm. These ripples started from various places and spread to every inch of the giant palm's skin. After they intertwined, it looked so chaotic and ugly However, this palm managed to block the dimensional division technique. The dimensional division technique, which could split almost anything, was actually ineffective against that palm. It couldn't really cut into the palm, and it couldn't really split the palm into countless dimensions. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan's eyes narrowed. The changes in front of him made him feel a little shocked. It must be known that even if it was the will of heaven and earth, it was only because it was too large and far exceeded the range of his division of dimensions that he was unable to get rid of it in one go. However, the palm in front of him, which was obviously a creation method of the will of heaven and earth, actually had such a defensive ability in the face of this division of dimensions. How could he not be shocked? At this moment, he had countless thoughts about the nature of the palm in front of him. This process seemed to be quite long, but in fact the entire process happened in less than an instant. If it was an ordinary living being, their reaction speed would not even be able to distinguish this instant. Of course, it was obvious that for Luo Fan, who could treat 100 trillion years as an instant, this instant was enough for him to react in countless ways. It was even enough for him to have some sort of inspiration, and then deduce this inspiration to the extreme, and finally turn it into his own remarkable ability to fight against the enemy. At this moment, even though the defensive ability and offensive ability of the invisible palm were unimaginably powerful and terrifying, Luo Fan did not despair and wait for the palm to press down and erase him. There are ripples, which means that the attack actually has an effect. It's just that the power is too weak, so it has no effect. At this moment, he was extremely clear in his heart. The ripples caused by the division of dimensions were clearly the result of the interaction between the division of dimensions and the invisible palm. The appearance of this result also represented the fact that the division of dimensions had actually caused some sort of damage to the invisible palm. It was just that this damage was nothing compared to the defensive ability of the invisible palm itself, which was why the attack only manifested in the form of ripples. Since this was confirmed, it was obvious that the next thing to do was to naturally strengthen the attack. As long as this kind of attack was continuously strengthened to a certain extent, then these ripples would definitely be strengthened to the point where they could completely split apart the invisible palm. It just so happened that it was not difficult for Luo Fan to strengthen the division of dimensions at this moment. At this moment, he had a thought. The perceptive mirror in his hand trembled slightly and suddenly expanded by 1,000 times. From the appearance of an ordinary copper mirror, it directly turned into a huge copper mirror that covered the sky. With this change, all sorts of inexplicable shadows suddenly burst out from Luo Fan's body. There was an extremely large number of these shadows, and after they burst out, they directly dissipated into nothingness as if they had never appeared in the first place. At the same time, the number of dimensions that were originally less than 10,000 instantly skyrocketed by 1,000 times. In the blink of an eye, the number had increased from less than 10,000 to nearly 100 million. At this moment, Luo Fan's body could not help but tremble slightly. Even though it was not difficult to expand the connection between a certain level and the dimensions, when a number increased to a certain extent and directly reached the order of nearly 100 million, the accumulation of the subtle pressure was extremely significant. At this time, Luo Fan clearly felt the invisible pressure that was released from the dimension and how strong it was. Under this pressure, it could be said that he completely relied on the material of the incarnation itself to resist the pressure. If it was not for the fact that the incarnation itself was made of a power that was close to that of a true sage, this pressure would have been enough to completely crush his incarnation. After paying such a huge price and withstanding such strong pressure, the effect of this attack was also quite considerable. At this moment, the many ripples on the invisible palm had become so dense that the invisible palm gradually lost its form. Under this terrifying ripple, the invisible palm looked like countless palms trying their best to overlap, but due to some kind of restriction, they could not perfectly overlap in the end. There were some subtle deviations between each other, forming the first overall image. Chapter 29:13. This clearly meant that the dimension severing technique had truly begun to take effect on the invisible palm. Now, although the invisible palm had yet to be completely divided into countless dimensions, it was only a final push away from being truly divided. In the face of such a situation, was there a need to say more about what to do? At this moment, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat, and the many dimensions constructed by the perceptive mirror trembled at the same time. Every dimension began to rapidly change position amidst the tremors. An indescribable tearing force was born from the countless dimensions in an instant. Along with this tearing force, the invisible palm, which originally had many shadows but was still a complete entity, instantly collapsed. The invisible palm was forcibly divided into hundreds of millions of different plane attributes, and was completely divided by the hundreds of millions of dimensions. It's actually so powerful. If I hadn't divided so many dimensions, I probably wouldn't have been able to do anything to it. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Looking at the plane attributes that belonged to the invisible palm that had been divided by hundreds of millions of dimensions, he completely understood the fact that he had spent so much effort to barely divide the invisible palm with dimensions. That formless palm was simply too mystical. Even though it had been divided into hundreds of millions of plane attributes, the vast majority of them were still extremely tough and powerful. Even though they had been separated, it was still extremely difficult to deal with them. If the individual attributes were already so tenacious and powerful, then when they were combined together, they would be able to protect, support, and support each other. In the end, they would be able to form a complete entity. This went without saying. Of course, this did not mean that the various plane attributes were all that powerful and tough. After all, the invisible palm could not possibly be perfect. This was especially so when it did not specifically target the plane attributes or strengthen the dimensions. Therefore, although the vast majority of the plane attributes were still extremely powerful and tough after being separated, it was ultimately only the vast majority. After all, there was still a small portion of the plane attributes that lost the cover, support, and support of the other plane attributes after being separated. Hence, their fragile nature was truly exposed. Obviously, in the face of Luo Fan's method of division, which was a combination of dimensions and planes, there was no need to mention the numerous weak points. However, a single weakness was enough to be fatal. At this moment, although Luo Fan was lamenting in his heart, his movements did not slow down at all. With just a slight thought, the dimension that enveloped the weakness was instantly annihilated. Along with the attributes of the invisible palm in those dimensions, along with this change, a formless shattering sound spread through the void within a range of who knows how many light years. Along with the shattering sound, the invisible palm finally collapsed. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared. However, as those layers of attributes were destroyed, the invisible palm was also completely annihilated. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan had an inexplicable expression on his face. He seemed to have come to a sudden realization, but also seemed to have an inexplicable sense of melancholy. At this moment, in the space-time that was the core of the world, countless figures of the world founders started to collapse one after another. In the end, a tenth of the figures of the world founders completely collapsed and disappeared without a trace, as if they had never appeared in the first place. However, this kind of collapse was only temporary. After they collapsed, the space-time started to vibrate subtly. All sorts of indescribably strange fluctuations started to sweep through the space-time again. Every time a fluctuation swept through, a figure of a world founder would appear. 10 fluctuations would sweep through, and 10 figures of the world founders would appear. 100 fluctuations would mean 100 figures. Just like that, the ripples swept out continuously, and the figures of the world's founders were continuously formed within it. Of course, even so, there were simply too many figures of the world founders that had been lost. Therefore, it was still not easy to make up for all the figures of the world founders that had been lost. At the very least, it would take a long time for the space-time to return to its former state. At this moment, Although Luo Fan did not see the changes in the space-time with his own eyes, he could already guess what the changes were based on the aura of the space-time. He did not see that the space-time was trembling, and every time it trembled, its aura seemed to swell and strengthen. It was as if some sort of power was constantly being injected into the space-time, causing it to continuously strengthen. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan smiled faintly. With a wave of his hand, the perception mirror disappeared without a trace. Immediately after, he waved his hand, and, as the space-time distorted, a door appeared in front of him. Without any hesitation, he directly stepped through the door and entered the space-time that was the core of the world. This time, he did not use any divine ability to sense the space-time. Instead, his avatar personally stepped into it and personally felt the various changes and attacks within the space-time. As his figure passed through the door, it instantly collapsed and disappeared without a trace. This area, which was the intersection point between the world and the core space-time, had completely returned to peace in the blink of an eye. In fact, it was even more peaceful than before Luo Fan had appeared. After all, before Luo Fan had appeared, the many derivatives in the surroundings would occasionally communicate with each other, causing the sea surface, the air, and even space-time to tremble. At this moment, the many derivatives were unprecedentedly calm. Although they were not dead, they did not move as much as before. In this way, this area was naturally rather peaceful. At this moment, Luo Fan had already entered the space-time that was the core of the world. When he arrived, he could clearly feel the fluctuations that appeared in the space-time again. Ordinary people would feel that every fluctuation was the same, and it could even be said that there was no difference. However, in Luo Fan's own perception, each of these fluctuations was unique, and they were completely different from any other fluctuations. Every fluctuation was like a special magnet that attracted a special existence from outside the space-time and gathered it in this space-time. Like this, the continuous undulations represented the continuous gathering of the special existences that were attracted here. It's not the original bodies of the world's founders, but some kind of special mark. Looking at the countless figures around him and feeling the unique characteristics of the fluctuations, Luo Fan made a judgment in his heart. The figures of the world's founders seemed to be the same as the original founders, but in reality, they were not even living creatures. In comparison, they were more like the divine dragon that Luo Fan had formed with the help of the perceptual mirror. They were more like a phenomenon, a landscape, a special existence that was born naturally and had no physical body. At this moment, an indescribable repulsive force acted on Luo Fan's body, as if it wanted to send him out of this space-time and make it impossible for him to stay in this space-time for a moment longer. Faced with such a change, Luo Fan merely waved his hand casually, and the repulsive force was instantly wiped out. It could no longer affect him. His entire body instantly became relaxed, and the surroundings became calm again, apart from the ripples that kept appearing. The reason for this was that Luo Fan's wave just now had not only wiped out the repulsive force that was attacking him, but it had also completely wiped out the source of the repulsive force. The repulsive force was produced because Luo Fan was a foreign object in this space-time. This was because he was a foreign object that was constantly affecting the surroundings, causing the surrounding space-time to sense him. That was why the repulsive force acted on him and wanted to expel him out of this space-time. In other words, there were three existences involved in the repulsive force. One of them was naturally Luo Fan. Because Luo Fan was a foreign object in this space-time, the space-time would produce a repulsive force to expel him. The second was this space-time. Even though Luo Fan was a foreign object in this space-time and was not something that was derived from the inside of this space-time, if the space-time itself did not repel such a foreign object, the repulsive force naturally would not have been produced. The third was the sense of existence that Luo Fan naturally emitted after entering this space-time. Even with the first two conditions, if this sense of existence did not emit, then the space-time naturally would not have been able to discover that Luo Fan had already entered. If it did not even discover him, there would naturally not be a repulsive force acting on Luo Fan. Obviously, with Luo Fan's ability, it was either that he was unwilling or that he couldn't eliminate the first and second conditions. Needless to say, how could Luo Fan eliminate himself to eliminate this repulsive force? If he did not exist, what was the use of eliminating this repulsive force? Needless to say, the second condition was even more obvious. If he could easily eliminate the space-time, why would he enter this space-time now? Why would he care about this repulsive force? Therefore, his erasure could only be targeted at the third condition. Fortunately, ever since he comprehended the means of combining dimensions and planes, Luo Fan's god art had been greatly enhanced. Previously, he needed to spend a lot of effort and methods to eliminate the sense of existence that he emitted. But now it was as easy as lifting a hand for him. That was why he was able to get rid of the repulsive force that targeted him so easily earlier. As the repulsive force was eliminated, his sense of existence in this space-time was equivalent to not existing at all. If the world creators around him were real world creators, and not just some marks, and phenomena, then his actions would definitely have been discovered. After all, he only eliminated the sense of existence that he emitted and did not completely hide himself. Although they could not sense him with their spiritual senses, they could still see him with their eyes. However, it was a pity that the world creators around them were only a phenomenon. Although they looked like real living beings, everything was just the appearance of that phenomenon. All of their actions, and even all of their interactions, were clearly the result of the natural operation of the laws of this space-time. Under such circumstances, their eyes, ears, noses, and all other sensory organs were actually just decorations. In this way, they could discover anything that could be discovered by this space-time, no matter how hidden it was. And for things that could not be discovered by this space-time, no matter how obvious it was, they would still turn a blind eye to it. Just like Luo Fan, who was in front of them right now. Even though he was so obvious in front of the world creators, even though there were a few world creators staring at him with lifeless eyes, they still did not react to his existence at all. From the looks of it, it was as if Luo Fan was just a clump of air here. After eliminating the repulsive effect of the space-time, Luo Fan did not show any joy. After clashing with the invisible palm, he had a deep understanding of this space-time. This situation couldn't be any more normal to him, and it was not worth being excited about. What's the use of gathering these things? Luo Fan looked at the figures of the world creators that were constantly fluctuating in this space-time and had this doubt in his heart. Although the invisible palm from before was extremely powerful, it was essentially similar to a clone of the world's will. Compared to Luo Fan, he only needed to resist the sudden attack at the beginning, and there was nothing else after that. He believed that the world's will was aware of this. Since the world's will knew this, why did it still create this space-time and gather such a degree of power? Was it purely here to deliver food to him? Chapter 29:14. The appearance of these figures was not the same as the appearance of living beings, or rather, the creation of living beings. No matter what kind of living being it was, the essence of life should appear first before everything else would appear. Even if it seemed to be a structure from the outside to the inside, the true order of appearance would be when the essence of life appeared first, before everything else would be constructed on the foundation of the essence of life, such as spirits, minds, space-time, flesh and blood, and so on. But at this moment, the situation was completely different with the appearance of the world's creator. The situation of the creator of this world was completely constructed out of thin air. It was constructed out of thin air from the image of this figure itself. This method of construction did not have any signs of the existence of the essence of life. Although the internal details were incomparably complicated and mysterious, everything that belonged to life was only left with an external image. It could be said that if it was not for the appearance of the creator, no one would believe that it was a living being just by looking at its internal structure. At this moment, Luo Fan's perception cut into the interior of the creator's figure, constantly wandering along every detail of its construction, clearly memorizing every detail in his heart. In the blink of an eye, he had completely memorized all the changes of the Creator. After that, he did not immediately start analyzing. Instead, he turned around and arrived at another location, paying attention to the process of another Creator's figure appearing from nothing. Just like that, in just a few hundred breaths of time, he had already seen every single detail of the tens of thousands of pioneers of this world, and he had deeply memorized all of it. At this point, he turned around and directly appeared at the location where he first appeared in this space-time. There was nothing special about this place, and even the distribution of the creators was no different from other locations. The reason why he chose this location was not because of the convenience it would bring him. Instead, it was because he was familiar with this location, because this was the place where he had first appeared, because he was familiar with it, and because he had first appeared in this location held a special place in his heart. At the very least, Jia's position was distinguished from the other positions. It was precisely because of this that when he wanted to choose a place to organize his thoughts, he chose this place. After coming to this place and standing still, many details of tens of thousands of world creators appeared in his mind. The way in which each world founder appeared was very different from the way in which other world founders appeared. It wasn't like what most people thought. Because they were of the same nature, they appeared in the same way. In fact, it was precisely because of this huge difference that Luo Fan did not choose the figures of a few founders. Instead, he chose the appearance of tens of thousands of founders as the basis for his deduction. At this moment, these countless details collapsed and directly turned into tens of thousands of rivers that flowed endlessly in his heart. The appearance of these details was extremely subtle and mysterious. The figures of the founders of the world were only a form. Their true core, their true essence, were the various mysterious structures inside. Therefore, if he continued to be limited to this kind of appearance and wanted to understand its essence and what it was, he would obviously be creating artificial obstacles for himself. The most effective method was to break it down and extract the essence contained within it, so that the appearance would no longer cause any interference to it. It was precisely because of this thought that he had directly erased the appearance of the many founders of the world. Instead, he reconstructed the many details and transformations, turning them into rivers. Just this slight change in appearance instantly made Luo Fan feel that there was a huge difference. Previously, because of the interference from the appearance of the world founders, the many seemingly different transformation methods did not seem to have anything in common in his eyes at all. It was as if all the transformation methods had no connection at all and were completely independent of each other. However, at this moment, when the external image of the creator of the world disappeared and its essence turned into a common image, the river, the way they appeared that had nothing to do with each other and had nothing in common, displayed a shocking commonality. A commonality that was clearly present in the many rivers and seemed to be the true core of the many rivers appeared in the rivers. This description seemed abstract, but if one were to look at it from another perspective, it would be very easy to understand. The surface of the rivers was completely different. It seemed like every river had its own characteristics, and every river had its own trajectory. However, the truth was that there was a tiny trail that belonged to all the rivers in the river. This tiny trajectory was so tiny that it was thousands of times smaller than a strand of hair. When it appeared in the rivers, it seemed even more insignificant and could not affect the trajectory of the entire river at all. Even if a river had this tiny trajectory, it could still change into countless positions and distort into countless shapes. In fact, even if it twisted around, it would not affect this tiny thread at all, of course. Under such circumstances, it would naturally be a fool's dream if it was just one or a few rivers trying to discover this thread. However, it was obvious that there were tens of thousands of rivers in his mind at this moment. Among the tens of thousands of rivers, it was obviously very difficult to find a common thread trajectory. At this moment, under the control of Luo Fan's mind, the tens of thousands of rivers began to slowly overlap in his mind. The illusory images of the rivers continued to overlap towards the center, causing the overlapping images to gradually appear in the middle of the river. In the end, when the tens of thousands of overlapping images appeared, the river that was originally at the center of the core had already expanded into an oval shape. All the overlapping images were very strange. Among the many overlapping images, almost all the strange angles could be distorted. In other words, any place in the area around the river could be crossed by one of the rivers. In this way, after the tens of thousands of rivers appeared, the overlapping images around the rivers naturally became like this at this moment. Of course, although it was almost oval in shape, it was only almost. The edge of the oval was still full of bumps, and there were irregular lines everywhere. At this moment, with just a thought from Luo Fan, the overlapping images began to be continuously shaved off. At this time, what was shaved off was naturally not the overlapping images of the rivers that were previously superimposed. Instead, it was the overlapping images that were too few. If the number of overlapping images was low, it meant that there were fewer rivers that passed through this area. In other words, the possibility of this area belonging to a common trajectory was lower. Along with this change, the oval illusory image began to gradually shrink. Luo Fan continued shaving off the illusory image. At first, he only shaved off the illusory image of a few rivers, or even an area that only one river passed through. However, as time passed, as the process of shaving off the illusory image continued to increase, the number of overlapping rivers also continued to increase. In a short, while almost all the illusory images had been completely shaved off, in the end, the overlapping illusory images of the tens of thousands of rivers were only left with a small, disjointed rule that appeared in his mind. This trajectory was still not perfect. At the very least, its disjointed parts were extremely imperfect. This trajectory was not in the shape of a long strip. Instead, it was a detailed, three-dimensional shape, and its shape gave Luo Fan an inexplicable sense of familiarity. It was as if he had seen this trajectory somewhere before, but he couldn't recall it no matter how hard he tried. This trajectory was still not the true trajectory. This was because the overlapping areas of the tens of thousands of rivers still did not perfectly outline this trajectory. Some fragments still did not reach the true body of the trajectory. There was still a small area that did not belong to the trajectory that was attached to it. This situation was obviously because there were not enough overlapping rivers. Of course, this was only a small matter. At least at this moment, it was only a small matter in front of the three-dimensional trajectory that Luo Fan found extremely familiar, but he couldn't say why. Why does it feel so familiar? What exactly is it? Luo Fan frowned and carefully observed the trajectory, thinking about what was going on with it. With a slight thought, he raised his hand and sketched in the void in front of him. As he sketched, the surrounding space-time actually began to vibrate subtly. All kinds of fluctuations that were gathering in various parts of the space-time actually began to gather towards him at this moment. Faced with this change, Luo Fan hurriedly stopped his movements. He was not afraid of these fluctuations. These fluctuations were actually nothing to Luo Fan, who had already mastered the combination of dimensions and planes to a rather deep level. If he wanted to, he could easily resist them. However, these fluctuations represented the essence of this space-time and also represented some kind of tentacle of the will of heaven and earth. If he destroyed these fluctuations, it would be equivalent to announcing to this space-time and the will of heaven and earth that he was here. Come, quickly come and see me. Obviously, if this was what he wanted, Luo Fan would not need to eliminate the sense of existence that his body emitted. Therefore, at this moment, in order to prevent his existence from being discovered by time and space and the will of heaven and earth, he stopped moving. Of course, at this step, although he had stopped moving, he had already clearly recognized the uniqueness of the trajectory in front of him. At the very least, this trajectory had some kind of power that he did not understand. Or rather, he understood it, but did not remember it at this moment. What is it? Why does it feel so familiar? This kind of power made Luo Fan want to explore the essence of this trajectory even more. With a slight thought, he spread out his perception and covered a large area. He continuously sensed the figures of the world's founders that were still appearing and being born from nothingness. He constantly sensed them and constantly constructed the entire details of their appearance from nothing in his heart. He then transformed them into the existence of rivers and began to overlap them with the trajectory that he had just excavated from the tens of thousands of world's founders. He gradually reduced the size of the trajectory, making the many details of the trajectory more and more specific and getting closer and closer to the true appearance of the trajectory. Because of his previous experience, this kind of action was carried out extremely smoothly this time. His senses, on the other hand, were able to easily sense the figures of large swathes of the world's founders, constantly memorizing the details of their changes into his own mind. During this process, the number of rivers he constructed increased, and the number of rivers that overlapped with the trajectory also increased. The trajectory was also shrinking bit by bit during this process. Every line was constantly shrinking and was constantly getting closer to the true essence of the trajectory. This process felt like something was constantly nibbling away at the trajectory, constantly gnawing away at the larger and thicker parts of the trajectory. As time passed, the trajectory continued to shrink. It looked as if it was going to be gradually obliterated. Gradually, it would disappear without a trace. This situation made Luo Fan frown involuntarily. He naturally did not frown because the trajectory was constantly shrinking. This situation was within his expectations. The reason he frowned was because the places where the trajectory was broken were still broken. No matter how many rivers he overlapped on top of it, the parts that were supposed to be disconnected were still disconnected. Furthermore, every single river was able to truly connect these disconnected parts together. Chapter 29:15. With his previous experience, it became easier for him to sense the changes in the figures of the world founders, and it became easier as time passed. In the beginning, he still needed 1 or 2 breaths to complete a cycle of memorizing the changes. But as time passed and he became more familiar with the task, the time began to shrink. Not long after, it had become thousands of cycles in a single breath. In every single round, he would simultaneously sense the changes in the figures of a large number of creators of the world. That way, he would be able to sense the changes of hundreds of thousands or even millions of founders with every breath, turning them into different rivers in his mind, overlapping their trajectories and sculpting them in this way. As time passed, the number of overlaps increased. The trajectories also became smaller and smaller, getting closer to their true appearance. Previously, Luo Fan did not destroy the figures in the space-time to the extent of destroying all of them. What was destroyed, however, was the figure of the heaven and earth creator was still limited. Even if the number was rather shocking, since it was limited, there would naturally be a time limit for them to recover no matter how many there were. Finally, at a certain moment, not long after, the many fluctuations that vaguely showed a chaotic state in this space-time suddenly disappeared without a trace. As the fluctuations disappeared, the figures of the world founders that were constantly emerging from the void naturally stopped changing. Originally, a large number of world founders would appear at every moment, but now, not a single world founder was born again. Evidently, this meant that the loss caused by the destruction of the invisible palm had been completely made up for. At this moment, Luo Fan trembled slightly and broke away from the state of constantly memorizing and transforming the information in his memories into rivers, and then overlapping them into the trajectories. Is that all? It's a pity that I can't reach true precision. Luo Fan had an indescribable look of regret on his face. Although he had previously memorized the entire process of the world founders being born from nothingness, there were still hundreds of millions of them. But compared to the trajectories, there were still a lot of them. At this moment, although the trajectories were more than 100 times smaller than before, there were still traces of carving. In the end, it still couldn't reach perfection and completely materialize the trajectories. This was obviously because the number of overlapping rivers was still too small. The trajectories were simply too complicated, and even if a single river could determine a single detail, it would require hundreds of millions of overlapping rivers to determine all the trajectories. Facing such a situation, how could he make the trajectories so precise with just a few rivers? However, it was clear that turning this trajectory into its true form was just a beautiful wish. It was as if infinity was a concept that could only be infinitely approached, but could never be achieved. Therefore, even if he had billions of rivers to calculate, the trajectory that he obtained might still be a little imperfect, and there might even be some imperfections. I can only look at this. At this moment, Luo Fan only focused his gaze on the trajectories. Although the many details of the trajectories had shrunk a lot, in fact, this shrunk had already made the trajectories thousands of times more complicated. This seemed very difficult to understand, but in fact, as long as the trajectories were magnified, they could be clearly seen. It was like a strand of hair and a pillar. If a strand of hair was in the pillar, it would look straight from afar. It would only have the attribute of being cylindrical. However, if this strand of hair was pulled out and allowed to freely change within the huge range of the pillar, how many shapes could this strand of hair change into within this range? Obviously, it was an almost infinite number. And now, the trajectories in Luo Fan's mind were like pillars at the beginning. Although these pillars were extremely small compared to the trajectories, even in Luo Fan's eyes, they were still extremely small lines. But in fact, compared to now, after the changes, the trajectories had become pillars, and the current ones were only strands of hair. Under such circumstances, the many details that were previously covered by the pillars were naturally revealed, and the appearance of these details naturally made the changes of the trajectories more complicated, even hundreds of times more complicated. It was precisely because of this that the entire trajectory was naturally 100 or even 1,000 times more complicated than the original. After becoming more complicated, the sense of familiarity that this trajectory gave Luo Fan had unknowingly increased a lot. I must have seen this trajectory somewhere before. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind at this moment. The source of that familiar feeling seemed to be right next to his mouth, but he just couldn't say it out loud and couldn't find the source of that familiarity no matter how hard he tried. The trajectories that I've come into contact with, the trajectories that are related to the simulated chaotic state, the trajectories related to the tribulations. Luo Fan couldn't figure it out, so he could only use the dumbest method to start comparing the trajectories that he had come into contact with bit by bit. The number of trajectories that he had come into contact with after entering the 7th tribulation was enough to make any cultivator feel incredulous. Even with Luo Fan's thinking ability, the time and energy needed to find and compare them one by one was extremely shocking. At this moment, faced with such a situation, Luo Fan seemed to be in a daze. It actually looked quite similar to the figures of the world creators around him. Of course, it was only a few similarities. After all, he was made of flesh and blood and was a living creature. Of course, he couldn't be exactly the same as this phenomenon. During this process, the sense of existence that his figure emitted was still in a state of non-existence. Clearly, the technique that he had used back then was still effective. It was still protecting him, preventing him from being discovered and rejected by this region of space-time. Of course, in fact, perhaps this rejection did not have much of an impact on him now. He had roughly obtained what he needed at this moment. At this moment, there was actually nothing wrong with leaving the space-time or even leaving this area that was the core of this world. However, if he left, who knew what he would encounter outside and whether there would be a new scheme from the will of the world? In that case, it would be better to stay here. At least, the situation here was something that he was familiar with, and he could deal with it with ease. Obviously, Luo Fan wouldn't choose to give up being able to deal with the attacks and troubles that might erupt at any time and in any way. This process of comparison lasted for a few months. At a certain moment after a few months, an indescribable aura appeared on Luo Fan's body. This aura had even broken through the restrictions of the technique that had completely erased his presence around him and directly descended into this space-time. At this moment, this space-time began to tremble. The countless world creators around him couldn't help but turn their gazes towards where Luo Fan was and stared at Luo Fan. It was an extremely strange scene. Immediately afterward, a strong repulsive force began to act on Luo Fan's body. It constantly impacted him and crushed him as if it wanted to directly crush him and expel him from his place. At this moment, the aura around Luo Fan's body continued to swell and strengthen. Vaguely, there was even a powerful resistance force that appeared around his body. It constantly interacted with the various repulsive forces, producing rumbling sounds and forming circles of ripples that began to spread in all directions. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan gradually returned to his senses. However, compared to before, his face was now filled with shock. It was as if he had suddenly discovered something that completely violated his worldview. It was a fact that he couldn't understand or believe at all. How could this be? How could this be? I should have known this would happen. At this moment, this was the only thought in Luo Fan's mind. This state of mind made his expression filled with shock, and his reaction to all the changes in the outside world became a little sluggish. At this moment, an invisible palm appeared in the sky once again. Furthermore, this time, it wasn't just the palm that appeared. Behind the palm, a huge silhouette started to appear, faintly discernible. The silhouette was so huge that it seemed to fill up the sky and earth. It seemed like even the space-time couldn't contain its existence, so most of its body seemed to be isolated from this space-time. Only the palm could enter this space-time and truly appear within it. At this moment, an unimaginably terrifying aura was continuously released from the silhouette. This aura was so terrifying that it caused the entire space-time to shake continuously. At this moment, Luo Fan had a feeling that he had been firmly sealed. It was as if the surrounding pressure and repulsive force had turned into ropes, tightly locking down his body, locking down his essence, locking down his karma, and locking down his fate. At this moment, Luo Fan even felt that his main body and his other incarnation seemed to have received some kind of lock and some kind of pressure. It felt as if, in the next instant, this palm would not only destroy his clone, but also his main body, his other clones, and even everything related to him. Everything would be completely destroyed by this palm, and completely destroyed. Faced with such a situation, an inexplicable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face as he gradually recovered from the shock. If he didn't recover, what awaited him would be death. How could he not recover? At this moment, he looked at the huge palm in front of him, as well as the huge, illusory figure behind the palm that seemed to be outside of time and space, or even outside of the world, unable to enter time and space at all. He had a different feeling in his heart than before. I didn't expect it to be like this. He sighed, raised his hand, and condensed a perception mirror in front of him in an instant. This perception mirror was more than 100 times larger than the one he had condensed before. After it appeared, it had a feeling of covering the sky and the sun. It appeared directly above his head, like a rather large island. It also cast a huge shadow on the ground. After this perception mirror appeared, the surrounding space-time was instantly divided into countless dimensions. At the same time, countless indescribable passageways were established in the various planes, directly connecting with these dimensions. They released unimaginable might and began to pull the attributes of the various planes that the dimensions targeted, spreading them out in all directions. This time, it was clear that it was not only the invisible palm that Luo Fan was targeting that was cut off. This time, it was also targeting the surrounding space-time, as well as the countless figures of the world's creators. Countless figures in space-time were instantly divided by the countless dimensions, as if they were divided into countless clones and incarnations. Faced with such a situation, an inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. The surrounding figures were divided, allowing him to clearly see many things that he couldn't see clearly before allowing him to recognize many things that could only be identified by turning countless details into a river. At the same time, above the invisible palm, there were countless dimensions that were dividing it, causing the invisible palm to rapidly divide at this moment. Countless layers of attributes were wrapped by the countless dimensions and directly appeared in front of Luo Fan, enduring Luo Fan's casual manipulation. Chapter 29:16. The reason why Luo Fan felt that the trajectory was extremely familiar was because the trajectory was the huge rune trajectory that he had drawn with the help of his own perception in the power related to the true divine. That huge three-dimensional rune was extremely mysterious. Even if it was Luo Fan who had drawn it, he was still confused about the rune's trajectory. He had no idea what kind of disparity it had or what kind of mysteries it contained. In fact, even if he wanted to reproduce it in the outside world, he would not be able to do so. It was as if there was a mysterious force that was interfering with him. Even if he wanted to start drawing it, the trajectory would seem vague, and he would not be able to unleash its true power. It was also because of this interference that he would unknowingly ignore the trajectory and throw it to the back of his mind after a long time. It was also because of this nature of the trajectory that Luo Fan could not recognize it after such a long time. He just felt that it was a little familiar. Of course, it was also because the trajectory in front of him was quite broken and was quite different from the trajectory that he had drawn with the power related to the true divine. To be able to use this method to simulate this trajectory, it's definitely not just the incarnation of the will of the tribulation level. This world's will is definitely the incarnation of the will that simulates the state of chaos. Only in this way can it have such a deep control over the countless founders of the universe. After confirming this, Luo Fan also saw the question that had been bothering him for a long time. All along, he had been unable to distinguish whether the world's will was the incarnation of the tribulation level or the incarnation of the will that simulates the state of chaos. After all, to him, be it the incarnation of the tribulation level or the incarnation of the will that simulates the state of chaos, they were both much larger than him. Moreover, they were both enough to do many things that the incarnation of the will had done to him. Therefore, in the face of various encounters and situations, he could only narrow his guesses about the incarnation of the will to one of the two. The will of heaven and earth was usually referred to as the incarnation of the will of calamity or the incarnation of the will of chaos. However, now that he had discovered the trajectory that he was familiar with, he knew that the will of heaven and earth was definitely not the incarnation of the will of the calamity level. That was because it was impossible for the incarnation of the tribulation levels to have such a deep understanding of the countless founders of the world in the simulated state of chaos. It was impossible for it to extract the essence of the power related to the true divine from the countless founders of the world. Only the will incarnation that simulated the primal chaos state could achieve this. It was like a police officer. He might be able to catch a criminal, but he could never know every detail of the criminal's thoughts. It was impossible to know what the criminal was thinking when he committed the crime. Only the criminal himself, or rather, only an existence that could control the criminal at all times could know all of this. To the creator of heaven and earth, the tribulation level was like a policeman. This policeman might have a good understanding of the criminal. So no matter how the creator of heaven and earth changed, it was impossible for him to escape. No matter how he committed the crime, it was impossible for him to escape the punishment of the policeman. However, it was obvious that the policeman could not know everything, let alone know when the criminal had done something unrelated to the crime. It was different for the incarnation that simulated the primal chaos state. To the simulation of the primal chaos state, any creator of heaven and earth was created by it. All of their activities were carried out inside the creator's body. To the creator of heaven and earth, the incarnation of the will that simulated the primal chaos state was like a high and mighty existence that was constantly observing him and controlling him. Such an existence could naturally understand the creator of heaven and earth better than the policeman. It could naturally understand all the details of the creator of heaven and earth, even the details that had nothing to do with the crime. Therefore, after seeing the broken rune trajectory, Luo Fan could already eliminate one of the two options and determine what the incarnation of the will of heaven and earth was. However, even though he knew this, he was still extremely shocked. The body of the creator of heaven and earth contained some subtle traces of the power related to the true divine, and this was something that Luo Fan was very clear about. After all, the power related to the true divine was a product of his seventh major tribulation. In other words, it was a power that his seventh major tribulation had specifically found from somewhere in the primal chaos state to target Luo Fan. Although this power seemed lazy and uninterested in anything, it had even become Luo Fan's umbrella. However, that was because the level of this power itself far surpassed the seventh major tribulation. This was because the power that was related to the true divine had already been tainted with the mysteries of the true divine. This mysteries allowed the power to have great autonomy, and it was even enough to break free from the restrictions of the seventh tribulation. In the end, this resulted in the current situation where the power related to the true divine was clearly targeting Luo Fan, but in the end, it actually became Luo Fan's umbrella. This was obviously a situation that could only occur after the power related to the true divine had completed its task. In the beginning, this power related to the true divine was ultimately meant to test Luo Fan and deal with Luo Fan. Since it had such a purpose, after it entered the seventh major tribulation, the existence that initially controlled the seventh major tribulation would obviously forcibly manipulate it to complete some task. Obviously, the existence that captured it was none other than the true primal chaos state. In the face of the true primal chaos state, even a true divine would have to give it face and act according to its wishes. It was just like the incarnation or projection of the true divine that Luo Fan had encountered in the previous few major tribulations. This power related to the true divine was obviously not comparable to a real true divine. In such a situation, in the face of the primal chaos state, it obviously did not have much ability to resist. Therefore, when it entered the seventh major tribulation for the first time, all its actions would definitely be completed according to the wishes of the primal chaos state. In other words, it would completely carry out all the arrangements for the seventh major tribulation. What was the arrangement for the seventh major tribulation? The creator of this simulated primal chaos state, as well as the endless heaven and earth in this simulated primal chaos state. The endless heaven and earth. All of this obviously involved the power related to the true divine. Otherwise, there was no need for this power related to the true divine to appear in the seventh major tribulation at all. Only by completing the biggest and most fundamental task could the power related to the true divine be freed and be able to leisurely enjoy the various things in the simulated chaotic state. Translator, Zephy's editor. Dioquin, only by completing the biggest and most fundamental task would the power related to the true divine be able to regain its freedom. Therefore, it was obvious that whether it was the simulated primal chaos state itself, the countless heaven and earth creators themselves, or even the heaven and earth created by the countless heaven and earth creators, they obviously contain some kind of trace of the power related to the true divine. These traces were extremely subtle and obscure. Even Luo Fan had never thought that these traces would have any use. Even if he had actually guessed what kind of task this power related to the true divine would appear in his seventh major tribulation, it was still the same. Now, the incarnation of the will in the simulated primal chaos state clearly told him what kind of use this trace had. Now, although the traces in front of him were extremely broken, they already had some charm of the true rune traces. This charm was the root cause of the appearance of the invisible palm. It was also the reason why there were endless figures of the heaven and earth creators in this space-time at this moment. Those figures of the heaven and earth creators were not heaven and earth creators at all. They were clearly the various traces left behind by the power related to the true divine on the bodies of the heaven and earth creators. This kind of trace existed on the bodies of every world creator. However, it was extremely weak and tiny inside the bodies of every world creator. It was precisely because of this that the endless traces of the world's founders were only able to form a broken rune trail that was only 10% of the complete trail. Of course, this trace was not impossible to perfect. The power related to the true divine clearly did not only create the heaven and earth creators and their corresponding heaven and earth. It also created the simulated primal chaos state. Even if it was not a complete simulation of the primal chaos state itself, it was definitely a large part of the simulated primal chaos state. Therefore, in order to find all the traces and gather all the essence and mysteries together, it was obviously not the only way to gather the traces of the heaven and earth creators. In order to make the rune trace complete, it was necessary to collect all the traces of the power related to the true divine that existed in the simulated primal chaos state in order to make it complete. This might be a little presumptuous, but at least for now, in Luo Fan's opinion, this was the most likely possibility. That power that was related to the true divine might have only left a trace of itself in the creation of certain things. The traces left behind for different things might be the same, or they might be different. From this perspective, even if the creation of the simulated primal chaos state had the participation of the power related to the true divine, it might not be able to leave all its traces in it, and it might not be able to gather the remaining traces into a complete picture of the power related to the true divine. However, this was only the opinion of ordinary people. In Luo Fan's opinion, this possibility was actually quite high. The appearance of the power related to the true divine had already shown its importance to the simulated primal chaos state, or in other words, to Luo Fan's seventh tribulation. If this power that was related to the true divine was dispensable, then it would be strange and unnecessary for it to appear here. Similarly, it was the same for the incarnation of the will that simulated the primal chaos state. For the incarnation of the will that simulated the primal chaos state, its appearance here in the seventh tribulation also meant that its appearance was extremely necessary. It could be said that it was a necessary and indispensable part of the seventh tribulation. Since that was the case, it also proved that he was also needed in the entire process of the formation of the seventh calamity. Both of them were necessary, which proved that either of them alone could not form the seventh tribulation, nor could they form everything in the simulated primal chaos state. Of course, these were only the two that Luo Fan had discovered so far. Perhaps there were more things behind it, and more factors were necessary and indispensable. However, this did not affect the current deduction. This also proved that the power related to the true divine was not everything for the seventh tribulation and the simulated primal chaos state. It didn't mean that the power and ability of the power related to the true sage wasn't completely superior to the simulated chaotic state. Therefore, if it wanted to construct the simulated primal chaos state and all the existences related to it, it would obviously need to go all out. It would need to activate all of its power and might in order to achieve this. After all, if it did not need to be fully activated, then it would mean that it did not need to go all out to complete all the tasks given by the primal chaos state. Obviously, in that case, why would other existences and other factors need to exist? Therefore, the appearance of this situation meant that the power that was related to a true saint had left all traces in the simulated state of chaos, as well as the many founders of the world and the many heavens and earths.